Section 1. The Nuclear Contamination Theory. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been visible on the horizon since 1989. It sits there in every establishing shot of the town. Its two cooling towers bleeding pale smoke into a permanently yellow sky, humming at a frequency so constant and so low that the people living beneath it stopped noticing it decades ago. It is part of the landscape the same way a river is part of a landscape, or a mountain range, something so consistently present that the mind eventually stops registering it as unusual and simply files it under background. The people of Springfield drive past it on their way to work. Their children grow up in its shadow. The smoke drifts over their backyards and their schools and their parks, and nobody looks up. But the show has been telling you something specific about that plant since the very beginning. Not through dramatic reveals or expository speeches, but through the slow, patient accumulation of detail across nearly 40 years and 800 episodes. And when you stop accepting that accumulation as cartoon background noise and start reading it as evidence, what you find is not a quirky fictional setting with an amusing nuclear facility as set dressing. What you find is a contamination zone. A town that has been systematically poisoned for decades by the facility that sits at the center of its economy and the center of its skyline, owned by a man who knows exactly what he is doing, operated by a man whose incompetence is not accidental, surrounded by a population whose inability to recognize their own situation is not stupidity, it is a symptom. Start with what the show actually tells us about the plant. It is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield and by most measures the wealthiest man in the region. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town, which means every home and business in Springfield is dependent on this facility in the most direct and unavoidable way possible. Burns does not just own the plant. Through the plant, Burns owns the town's relationship with electricity, with heat, with the basic infrastructure of modern life. You cannot opt out of what Burns is selling without leaving Springfield entirely. During a surprise safety inspection, the kind of inspection designed to give regulators an honest picture of a facility's actual operating conditions, rather than the version the facility would have prepared if given advance notice, the inspectors found 342 violations. Not 3, not a dozen. 342 separate deficiencies, failures, and dangerous conditions inside a facility whose proximity to a residential population makes every one of those violations a potential catastrophe. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with basic safety standards was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it. Not because the money was beyond his reach. Burns is a billionaire many times over, a man whose fortune has been growing since before the 20th century began. The $56 million required to make the plant safe for the people living around it represents a fraction of what he is worth. He refused because spending the money would mean acknowledging that the problems existed, and acknowledging that the problems existed would force a question that Burns had spent decades making sure nobody asked. If the plant had been operating with 342 violations for years, what had those violations already done to the people living downwind? The violations themselves are worth sitting with individually, because their nature reveals something important about the kind of negligence the show is describing. Radioactive waste was being dumped directly into bodies of water, rivers, and streams that feed into the water supply of a residential town. Radioactive waste was being deposited near children's playgrounds. Plutonium weapons-grade radioactive material was being used as a paperweight on someone's desk inside the facility, the way you might use a rock or a heavy book, the most casual possible relationship with one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. The cooling towers had structural cracks patched with chewing gum. Not sealed by engineers, not repaired by specialists, patched with the same material a 10-year-old might use to fix a cracked plastic toy, holding together the containment infrastructure of an active nuclear reactor. There were luminous rats in the walls, actual rats whose fur had absorbed enough radioactive material that they glowed in the dark, running through the pipes and ventilation systems of a facility that was supposedly managing its radioactive materials responsibly. And then there were the skeletons. Human skeletons in the basement of the Springfield nuclear power plant. The show introduces this detail during the safety inspection and moves on without comment. No investigation. No news coverage, no authority figure opens a case. The inspection notes that there are human remains in the basement of an active nuclear facility, and Springfield shrugs. And the next joke arrives, and the cooling towers keep humming. The show never tells you who those people were or how they ended up dead in that basement. It just shows you the bones and expects you to file it under the long list of things about the Springfield nuclear power plant that nobody wants to look at too carefully. The man whose job it is to prevent all of this, the safety inspector whose literal professional function is to stand between the plant's violations and the health of the surrounding community, is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator has stated that Homer has an IQ of 55, placing him at the most extreme lower end of the human cognitive range, below the threshold that most clinical frameworks use to define intellectual disability. In one episode, it is discovered that a crayon has been lodged in Homer's brain since childhood, physically compressing and impairing his cognitive function. The crayon is not metaphorical. It is a literal foreign object sitting inside his skull, reducing his already limited intelligence further through direct physical pressure on the brain tissue it is embedded in. Homer sleeps at his workstation. He eats donuts during meltdown warnings, not as a casual disregard for the alarm, but seemingly without registering that the alarm is connected to anything requiring his attention. He once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen. He falls asleep, he eats, he watches whatever is on the monitor nearest to him, and the reactor hums behind the glass, and the violations accumulate, and the water keeps flowing through the cracked pipes into the river that feeds the town's supply. That is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. He has been standing there for over 3 decades. The first visible mutant in Springfield appears in Season 2, Blinky, the three-eyed fish, pulled from a river downstream from the power plant. This is not treated quietly within the show's universe. Blinky becomes national news. A gubernatorial candidate uses the fish as the centerpiece of a campaign to hold Burns accountable for environmental contamination. Burns is forced to sit down on live television and eat the fish in front of cameras to prove it is harmless. He does it. The town watches. And then Springfield moves on. Nobody conducts a follow-up study of the river. Nobody tests the drinking water. Nobody asks the single most obvious question that the discovery of a three-eyed fish downstream from a nuclear plant should generate. If the fish are mutating, what is happening to the people consuming the same water? The answer to that question comes in Season 8, in an episode called The Springfield Files, and it arrives dressed as a science fiction comedy so effectively that most viewers miss what the show is actually confessing. Homer, walking through the woods near Springfield one night, encounters a glowing figure. He is convinced he has seen an alien. The town becomes alarmed. FBI investigators are called in. The episode builds toward a reveal that it has been carefully constructing, and when the reveal arrives, the figure in the woods is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with radiation therapy and experimental pharmaceutical compounds, that the treatment causes his entire body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he would die within the week. The regimen is so disorienting and so physically overwhelming that after each session, Burns wanders out of the treatment facility in a dazed and euphoric state, moving through the woods near the plant like something that has crossed the boundary between the world of the living and something adjacent to it. He glows in the dark, not as a figure of speech. Burns is so saturated with radiation that his body emits visible light, and Springfield residents look at this glowing figure moving through the trees, and their first instinct is to conclude that they have encountered a visitor from another planet. Not that they have encountered the effects of the nuclear facility that dominates their skyline. An alien. That is the depth of the denial that the plant has cultivated in this community. That is how thoroughly Springfield has trained itself to look past the most obvious explanation for the strange things happening around it. The Simpsons movie makes the contamination impossible to argue with on any level. Springfield's environmental degradation reaches a point so extreme that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency, operating within the show's fiction as a real governmental body with real authority, determines that the only adequate response is physical containment. A massive glass dome is lowered over the entire town to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. The United States government, after assessing what Springfield has become, concludes that the most proportionate response to its environmental condition is to seal it off from the rest of the nation, not to clean it up, not to remediate the contamination, to contain it, to place a physical barrier between Springfield and America so that whatever is happening inside the dome stays inside the dome. Springfield is not just a polluted town in this moment. Springfield is classified by a federal agency as an environmental hazard zone, too far gone for any remediation that does not begin with full quarantine. And every resident is still inside when the dome descends. Now look at the people inside. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not correspond to standard human anatomy by any available biological framework. His eyes protrude from his face at a proportion no human face produces. He has 4 fingers on each hand. His IQ, as established by the show's own creator, places him at the clinical lower end of intellectual function. His body can sustain physical punishment that would kill an ordinary person many times over. Homer has been shot, electrocuted, dropped from cliffs, struck by vehicles, caught in explosions, subjected to forces that should have resulted in fatality on dozens of separate occasions across the show's run. He walks away from all of them. Not because the show is being careless with continuity, but because the show is consistent about it. Homer's resilience to physical damage is a documented, repeating feature of his biology. His healing rate is not normal. His tolerance for injury is not normal. And he has spent the entirety of his adult life working in direct proximity to an active nuclear reactor core, breathing the air of a facility with 342 safety violations, drinking the water of a town whose river produces 3-eyed fish. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers. Hair that grows straight upward in a tower that has maintained the exact same shape for 36 years without product, without structural support, in apparent defiance of gravity, and the physics that govern the behavior of human hair. Marge worked at the nuclear plant herself at one point. She was directly exposed to the same facility, the same violations, the same radiation. All 3 of her children were born after both parents had already spent years absorbing whatever the plant's environment does to human biology. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were born in Springfield. All 3 of them display physical characteristics that do not appear in any human population outside of the town's borders. The spiky hair that holds its shape without product or intervention, the overbites, the bulging eyes, the yellow skin that covers every permanent resident of Springfield and nobody else in the entire world beyond it. That last point is the one that makes everything click into focus, and it is hiding in plain sight in every scene the show has ever produced that involves an outsider visiting the town. When outside characters come to Springfield, when celebrities appear as guest characters, when government officials or visitors from the broader world walk into scenes, they look different. Their proportions sit closer to realistic human anatomy. Their eyes are positioned normally in their faces. Their features have the quality of something drawn to resemble actual people, rather than the Springfield aesthetic that we have been trained to read as simply the show's art style. The show draws outsiders differently than it draws Springfield residents. The difference is visible in every such scene, and the accepted explanation is that it is purely an artistic choice, a way of visually distinguishing guest characters from the established cast. But within the internal logic of the show's own universe, there is a consistent and visible difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who come from outside it. People who live in Springfield display physical characteristics that deviate from normal human anatomy. People who come from outside Springfield do not display those characteristics. The outsiders look like people. The insiders look mutated. Even the animals follow this pattern. Santa's little helper, the family dog, has the same bulging eyes, the same proportional distortions that mark his owners as Springfield residents. The wildlife downstream from the plant, most famously represented by Blinky, shows documented mutation. The show points directly at the fish and says, "This is what the radiation is doing to living things in this environment." And then it expects viewers to accept that the same radiation has had no effect on the humans who have been living in the same environment for decades, drinking the same water, breathing the same air, absorbing the same contamination. Burns has always known. This is not an inference from the theory. The show makes it explicit across multiple episodes, in the gaps between its jokes, in the details it drops and does not return to. Burns funds private medical research. He retains personal physicians whose employment contracts presumably include confidentiality provisions extensive enough to survive decades. He undergoes the weekly treatments that keep him functioning. Burns understands what radiation does to biological systems at a level of personal intimacy that nobody else in Springfield can match. Because radiation is keeping him alive, and he has been managing that relationship for over a century. He has an entire pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing experimental treatments. His understanding of radiation exposure and its biological effects is not theoretical, it is operational. When German investors briefly purchased the plant from Burns, the sequence of their decisions reveals everything. The first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was commission a full assessment of the cost required to bring the facility up to code. The estimate nearly drove them into bankruptcy. They had not anticipated the scale of what had been allowed to accumulate. They sold the plant back to Burns almost immediately, and Burns, having reacquired the facility, rehired Homer the same day. A competent safety inspector would have shut the plant down within a week of taking the job seriously. Homer ensures the violations continue. Not through malice. Homer is not capable of sustained malice. Through incompetence so thorough and so reliable that it functions as a guarantee, the radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. The fish keep developing extra eyes. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and through the economy, its population. A population whose cognitive function has been eroded by decades of exposure to the very thing Burns depends on to stay alive. The crayon in Homer's brain is the most explicit piece of evidence the contamination theory has in the canon. In Season 12, the crayon is removed. The change in Homer is immediate and comprehensive. His IQ rises to genius level. He becomes articulate in a way he has never been before. He can analyze complex situations. He can understand the systems operating around him. He can read the architecture of his own life and see it clearly for the first time. And what he sees, when he finally has the cognitive capacity to see it, is unbearable. He sees what Springfield is. He sees what his job is. He sees what has been done to him and around him and through him for decades. He sees the contamination theory, essentially, with his own suddenly functional mind, and it breaks him. He has the crayon put back in. He chooses, consciously and deliberately, to return to the fog. Because being intelligent in Springfield is worse than the alternative. Because the intelligence shows you things you cannot unsee and cannot change and cannot live comfortably inside once you have seen them. But the deeper question, the one the show places in the episode and never examines, is how the crayon got there in the first place. How did Homer pass through an entire childhood and adolescence and decades of adult life visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving medical care from Springfield professionals, and not one of them ever found a foreign object sitting inside his skull? Either Springfield's entire medical establishment is operating below any reasonable standard of competence, or someone in that medical establishment knew the crayon was there and made a decision not to address it. And if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of the town he effectively owns, if the doctors are operating under some arrangement that keeps them from looking too carefully at the neurological condition of the population, then Homer's crayon is not a childhood accident that was somehow missed. It is a condition that was managed, maintained, perhaps even useful. The radiation theory does not explain one thing about the Simpsons universe and leave everything else standing. It explains all of it, simultaneously, from a single premise. Nobody ages because the contamination has altered the biology of every Springfield resident at the cellular level, disrupting the normal mechanisms of aging in the same way it disrupted the normal mechanisms of healthy development. The town resets after catastrophes because the population's memory and critical thinking functions have been damaged by chronic neurological exposure to the same substances the plant has been releasing for decades. Homer survives things that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that make it nearly indestructible, while simultaneously devastating the cognitive function that a normal biology would have protected. Burns stays alive through his treatments because he has been managing his own radiation exposure with resources nobody else in Springfield can access. And nobody asks why the fish have 3 eyes, or why the skin is yellow, or why the children have 4 fingers. Because the same contamination that produced those characteristics also damaged the part of the brain responsible for asking questions like that. Springfield is not a quirky setting for a cartoon family. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its people are not eccentric characters in a long-running comedy. They are symptomatic. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery from injuries that should be fatal, every catastrophic event that gets forgotten by the following episode, all of it traces back to the same cracked cooling towers, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply that feeds the same damaged brains, that cannot figure out why their fish have 3 eyes or their children were born with 4 fingers. The plant is not part of Springfield's story. The plant is the story. It has been the story since the 17th of December, 1989, and nobody in Springfield will ever figure that out, because the plant already made sure they cannot. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. It takes 1 second and it means everything. Now get comfortable, because we are just getting started. Section 2. Homer's Coma Theory. On the 1st of April, 1993, The Simpsons aired the 18th episode of its 4th season. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, and its premise was designed to be light and celebratory. A clip show framed by a storyline in which Bart plays a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer. The escalation ends when Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and places it inside an industrial paint shaker. He seals it carefully. He waits for the pressure to build inside to a level that no beer can is designed to contain, and then he gives it to Homer. Homer opens the tab in his kitchen, and the explosion that follows is violent enough to send him to the hospital with injuries serious enough to require admission. Homer is lying in his hospital bed, recovering, when he notices a vending machine on the other side of the room. He wants a candy bar. He gets up to reach for the machine. The machine tips, and Homer Simpson, already in the hospital, is crushed beneath its weight. He flatlines. The monitors go flat. The medical team responds. And Homer's conscious awareness goes dark. Not as a joke, not as a cutaway into a dream sequence, not as a brief comedic moment that resolves in 30 seconds. Homer enters a clinically documented coma that, within the episode, lasts for 7 weeks. The episode ends with Homer appearing to wake up. Bart is crying at his bedside, confessing through genuine tears that the prank was his fault, that the whole chain of events started with him, and Homer springs suddenly awake and reaches immediately for his son's neck in the strangling gesture that has been a running gag since the 1st season. The family laughs with relief. Everything returns to normal. The show moves on, except in the final moments of the episode before the credits roll, Homer is informed that the coma caused permanent neurological damage. He has lost 5% of his brain function, not temporarily. The damage is described as permanent, as tissue that is gone and cannot be recovered. 5% of a brain that was already functioning at the extreme lower end of the human cognitive spectrum, already compromised by a crayon that nobody in Springfield had thought to remove. 5% gone. And Homer's response upon learning this, the response of a man who has just been told his brain is permanently more damaged than it already was, is to laugh. He says he does not even know why he is laughing. The family finds this endearing. The credits roll. The show continues for 32 more years as if the coma never mattered. Unless the coma was the only thing that ever mattered. This is the Homer coma theory. Its premise is clean and devastating in equal measure. Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. The moment the vending machine fell, Homer's conscious connection to the actual world ended. Everything that has aired since that date, every storyline, every adventure, every celebrity encounter, every impossible event, every season across 3 decades of television is a dream. The product of a comatose mind lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, generating an ongoing simulation of life and family and continuity, because the alternative to the simulation is confronting what it means when the simulation finally stops. The theory was first articulated in this form on Reddit, attributed to a user called HardTopic A Name. It is the single most debated fan theory in Simpsons history. Its persistence is not the result of aggressive promotion by its advocates. It persists because every time someone new encounters it and goes back to look at the show with the theory in mind, the evidence is there, consistent, quiet. Embedded in the structure of the show in ways that were present whether or not anyone intended them. Start with the most immediately visible piece of evidence. the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a specific kind of show. Not realistic in the way that live-action dramas are realistic, but grounded in recognizable human experience. Homer tries to quit drinking and cannot. Marge worries that her marriage is deteriorating while her husband fails to notice the things that worry her. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has to sit with the particular grief of that infatuation ending when the teacher leaves the school. Bart faces the possibility of being held back a year and has to reckon with what that would mean for his sense of who he is. These are the problems of a real American family, filtered through the distorting lens of satire and animation. But the distortion does not remove the recognizable core: financial stress, marital tension, the complicated love between a parent who is not doing enough and a child who is doing their best to be okay with it. The show's emotional foundation was domestic in a way that allowed it to do something genuinely moving inside the comedy. After the coma, the show becomes something different. The change is not gradual. It is not the kind of creative drift that accumulates imperceptibly across seasons. It is a shift, and it is dramatic. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante street justice group. Homer joins the Stonecutters, a secret society with implications about the hidden structure of the world that the episode explores, and then dissolves into comedy without resolution. Homer discovers that his mother has been living as a fugitive radical for 27 years. Homer meets God, in person, twice. Homer goes to college. Homer becomes a food critic. Homer becomes a missionary. Homer becomes an astronaut. Homer travels to dozens of countries, holds hundreds of different jobs, befriends celebrities, gets involved in political conspiracies, and survives physical trauma on a scale that would defeat a combat soldier in ideal physical condition. The gap between the show's pre-coma and post-coma identity is so wide and so clearly located at a specific moment in the timeline that the internet has been arguing about it for 20 years under the general heading of "When did The Simpsons get bad?" The coma theory proposes that the question is being asked incorrectly. The show did not get bad. Homer's brain got worse. The escalating absurdity, the progressive detachment from physical and psychological consequence, the increasingly dreamlike quality of the post-season 4 plots, these are not symptoms of creative decline. They are symptoms of a mind that is deteriorating. The simulation Homer's brain is running is getting less stable over time because the brain running it is losing function. The dreams get stranger as the dreamer's condition worsens. There is a piece of evidence that sits 6 months before the coma, in the season 4 premiere, and it is the detail that gives the whole theory its most unsettling dimension. In the episode Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. An actual face-to-face conversation with a figure the show presents as the genuine divine presence. The conversation is played for comedy, as most divine encounters in The Simpsons are, but during it God tells Homer something specific. Homer will one day learn the meaning of life. His time is coming. God is not dismissing him or consoling him. God is giving Homer a timeline. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. God told Homer his time was nearly up, and 6 months later, Homer's conscious life effectively ended. What the show presents as a quirky theological gag, a moment of divine comedy in an episode about Homer skipping church, reads under the coma theory as something that was placed there deliberately or accidentally, but sits there, with an accuracy that is hard to dismiss once you have noticed. God was warning Homer. The meaning of life God was referring to was not a philosophical revelation. It was the experience of losing consciousness in a hospital room and spending the rest of existence dreaming about the family you left behind. The aging problem is where the coma theory achieves something no other explanation of the show's structure comes close to matching. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not added a wrinkle or a gray hair. The show uses a floating timeline, a production approach in which the characters exist in a permanent present, where the year around them updates to stay current while they remain fixed at the ages they started, but a floating timeline is a description of the phenomenon, not an explanation for it. The radiation theory proposes cellular mutation that has disrupted the aging process. Cartoon logic suggests it is simply how animated series work. The coma theory offers the simplest answer, and it is the one that lands hardest when you actually hold it. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who lost consciousness in April 1993 and has not woken up since. Of course, Bart is still 10. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine Bart aging because Homer was not there to watch it happen. The last time Homer saw his son, Bart was 10 years old. The specific 10-year-old that Homer's memory contains with perfect fidelity. The last time Homer held his youngest daughter, she was a baby. The last time Homer came home to Marge, she looked exactly like the Marge in every episode. His memory of his family is fixed at the moment the vending machine fell, because memory cannot update itself when you are unconscious. The dream preserves everyone Homer loves at the age he last experienced them, because that is what a dreaming mind has to work with. Homer cannot imagine his children growing up because growing up happens in time, and Homer is no longer moving through time. He is suspended inside a single prolonged moment, and the people in the moment with him are suspended there alongside him. The celebrity appearances that flood the post-coma seasons of the show, the wave of famous people who arrive in Springfield to interact with the characters for 22 minutes and then disappear back into the cultural ether without any lasting impact on the show's world, make complete sense within the coma framework. Homer is in a hospital room. The room has a television. Nurses come and go. Visitors come and go. Sounds filter through the unconsciousness. News programs, conversations at his bedside, a radio playing somewhere down the hall, the background noise of a hospital that is running its ordinary operations around a man who is not quite participating in them. Homer's dreaming brain receives these ambient signals and processes them. Fragments of names and faces and voices absorbed through the fog of unconsciousness get woven into the simulation. That is why later seasons are full of celebrities in Springfield. It is not because the fictional town became inexplicably attractive to famous people. It is because a comatose man's mind keeps incorporating fragments of the external world into the dream it is sustaining to keep him company. The show itself eventually felt compelled to respond to this theory, which is significant precisely because the show almost never responds to fan theories on any level. In season 34, a scene was released, apparently a deleted scene from the episode Lisa the Boy Scout, in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and discovers that every outlandish episode of his life was a dream. The scene was fully animated, fully voiced, convincingly presented. And then the show clarified that the scene had been planted as a hoax by fictional hackers within the episode's universe, that it was not real, and that Homer was not in a coma. But the writers made the scene. They spent production resources animating and voicing a complete sequence in which Homer wakes from a coma and discovers his life was a dream, and then they dressed the scene as a deliberate fake and released it. The dismissal of the theory came packaged inside the most elaborate possible acknowledgement that the theory was worth dismissing. You do not animate the thing you are denying unless the thing you are denying has gotten under your skin. They showed you the truth and labeled it a hoax, and the audience laughed, just like Homer laughed when he was told he had lost 5% of his brain. He said he did not know why he was laughing. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in interviews and was unambiguous. It is not true. Homer is not in a coma. The show is not a dying man's dream. But Jean's denial had specific gaps that his interviewers did not push on. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not account for the progressive unreality of the show's post-coma plots, the way each season moves further from the domestic grounding of the early years and deeper into a territory that feels less like a show about a family and more like a fever dream that occasionally remembers it is supposed to be about a family. He said it is not true, and the conversation moved on. But the evidence did not move on, because the evidence is the structure of the show itself. The reset button between episodes, the way Springfield can experience a world-altering catastrophe, a disaster that in any realistic framework would permanently alter the lives of every person involved, and return to baseline by the following week, as if nothing happened, is perhaps the most consistently observable feature of the coma theory's internal logic. When we dream, each dream is its own closed environment. The events of one dream do not carry into the next. Homer's coma dream resets between episodes because that is what a mind does between sleep cycles. The simulation does not maintain continuity across its cycles because Homer's deteriorating brain cannot sustain that level of coherence. The world resets. The family is intact. The episode begins fresh. Not because the writers are being careless, because the dreamer is doing his best. Homer's physical invulnerability in the post-coma seasons, the way he survives, falls and explosions, and impacts that should shatter a human body, the way he absorbs damage on a scale that belongs in a superhero story rather than a family sitcom, is explained with clean elegance by the coma framework. Nothing can kill Homer in the dream, because Homer is not in the dream physically. His body is in a hospital bed. His body cannot be harmed by a falling piano or a nuclear near-miss or a cliff fall, because none of those things are happening to his body. They are happening to the avatar his dreaming mind created to represent him. And a dreaming mind cannot kill the person doing the dreaming. The avatar survives everything because the person imagining the avatar needs the story to keep going. The emotional weight of the coma theory is what gives it a staying power that analytical arguments alone cannot produce. If the theory is true, the show is not a comedy. Not at its foundation. At its foundation, the show is about a man who loved his family so completely that when he lost consciousness, his brain built an entire world to keep living inside that love. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind reaches for and constructs an entire universe to contain, is not complicated. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous 10-year-old. He wants Lisa to still be playing saxophone in her room and fighting for things she believes in. He wants Maggie small enough to hold. He wants the house on Evergreen Terrace and the sound of his family moving around inside it, and the particular feeling of coming home after a day at the plant and having something to come home to. That is the whole dream. Everything else, the adventures, the celebrities, the impossible jobs, the trips abroad, the schemes and disasters, is the dream filling itself in around the thing Homer actually cares about. The family. Always the family. The reason the dream cannot end is not that Homer's brain is too stubborn to release it. It is that releasing it means waking up. And waking up means discovering how much time has passed in the real world. How old his children actually are now. Whether Marge waited, whether anyone is still sitting at the bedside, or whether the vigil ended years ago and the room is quiet and he is alone in it. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. Under this theory, it is the closest thing to mercy that a man like Homer Simpson gets. A dream where his children are always young, where his wife always loves him, where the beer is always cold and the house is always there and the family never has to say goodbye, because in the dream, they never leave. The coma theory will not be confirmed by the show. It has been officially and repeatedly denied. But the denial has never addressed the evidence, and the evidence is embedded in 32 years of television in a way that denial does not dissolve. Nobody ages. The world gets stranger. The consequences do not persist. The family is always intact when the credits roll. And Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode, because in the dream, he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The summer of 1995 was unlike any other moment in the history of American animation. The Simpsons had decided to run a murder mystery. Not a parody of a murder mystery, not a treehouse of horror speculation, but an actual constructed whodunit with real suspects and real evidence and a genuine cliffhanger designed to hold an audience in suspense for an entire summer. Fox promoted it with the kind of theatrical ambition usually reserved for network events far larger than a single animated episode. America's Most Wanted produced a companion special called Springfield's Most Wanted, framing the fictional shooting of a cartoon billionaire as though it were an unsolved real-world crime. Viewers were invited to submit their guesses. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. The prize was significant. The cultural moment was real. And what the contest ultimately revealed was something more interesting than who shot Mr. Burns. It revealed that the mystery's official answer might not be the right one. But let us start at the beginning, with the crime itself, because the setup matters. Burns had spent the two-part episode going further than he had ever gone before, even by his own considerable standards of catastrophic self-interest. He stole an oil well that had been discovered beneath Springfield Elementary School, diverting the proceeds that should have funded the school's budget into his own accounts and leaving the educational programs that depended on that funding without resources. He drove Moe's Tavern into bankruptcy through financial maneuvering that the episode depicts but does not fully explain, because the how matters less than the outcome. He created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing its elderly residents without compensation or alternative arrangements. He injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a way that required emergency veterinary treatment. And then he built a device, a massive mechanical sun-blocking disc that he deployed over the entire town of Springfield, physically blocking sunlight from reaching the community below. Not metaphorically. Burns literally stole the sun from Springfield, covering the town in artificial darkness so that its residents would have no choice but to draw their electricity from his nuclear plant, because without sunlight there would be no solar alternatives, no reason to go outside, no way to live normally without the power Burns controlled. When his assistant Smithers objected to this plan and refused to carry it out on the grounds that it was simply too much, that blocking the sun from an entire town crossed a line that even their long professional partnership could not accommodate, Burns fired him on the spot. Every person in Springfield had a documented, specific, personal reason to want Burns harmed. The show established this methodically, almost exhaustively, giving viewers enough material to construct viable motives for more than a dozen characters. Homer, because Burns could never remember his name after years of direct employment, a failure of recognition that had escalated from professional insult to something that felt personal and pointed. Bart and Lisa, because of the school funding. Grandpa, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because Burns's actions cost him his livelihood. Tito Puente, because Burns eliminated the music program. Moe, because his bar was financially destroyed. Smithers, freshly fired and reportedly drinking heavily. The list goes on. The entire town assembled at a public meeting to confront Burns, and the episode's cinematography documented the weight of the moment. Multiple characters shown holding weapons, faces tight with the specific kind of fury that Springfield residents rarely allow themselves to display so openly. Burns collapsed, a single gunshot wound. He staggered to the town's sundial and fell, his hands coming to rest on two letters. Depending on which direction you oriented the reading, those letters were either W and S or M and S. The ambulance took him away. The screen went dark. And America had 3 months to decide who pulled the trigger. When Part 2 aired in September 1995, the investigation that followed was structured as a procedural comedy. Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police pursued the case with the competence that viewers had come to expect from them, which is to say they got some things right accidentally while getting most things wrong deliberately. Smithers confessed immediately. He had the clearest surface-level motive: recently fired, emotionally destabilized, carrying a long history of complicated feelings about Burns that the show had been building since the beginning. But his confession collapsed when the evidence showed he had been blackout drunk at the time of the shooting and had actually fired his weapon at an entirely different person in an entirely different location. He had shot old Jasper in the wooden leg at Moe's Tavern. Wrong victim, wrong location, wrong crime entirely. Smithers was cleared. Suspects were eliminated across the episode. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had what is almost certainly the greatest alibi in the history of television, a fully produced, fully choreographed musical number in which he performed a samba he had written specifically to channel his rage at Burns into creative expression rather than violence. The investigation stalled until the police found physical evidence at the scene, an eyelash on Burns's clothing. DNA analysis indicated the eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. His motive was the most extensively documented of any suspect. He was arrested. The case was essentially closed. And then Burns woke up. He looked around his hospital room, gathered his bearings, and identified his attacker, Maggie Simpson, the baby, 1 year old. Burns's account was that after the town meeting, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot. He had attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle over the lollipop, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Chief Wiggum noted with visible relief that no jury in the world would convict a baby. The case was closed. Springfield moved on. Except the contest had already revealed something that the episode's confidence in its own resolution did not account for. When the DVD commentary was recorded years later, the producers acknowledged openly that in their randomly sampled review of contest entries, not a single participant had submitted Maggie as the correct answer. Not one. The contest had been promoted on the premise that the answer was deducible from the clues in part 1. The nation had been watching, paying attention, trying to solve it. And the answer, when revealed, had not been reached by anyone in the sample pool. The prize went to a randomly selected entrant who received a cash payment instead of the promised animation because the correct answer had not been submitted. One person had posted the correct answer online on the night of the original broadcast on a Simpsons news group using a college internet account. By the time the show tried to locate this person, the account was gone. The one person who apparently solved it could not be found. The show issued an open invitation on the DVD for that person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. The implications of this deserve careful consideration. The show designed a mystery, claimed publicly that it was solvable from the available clues, ran a national contest around that claim, and when the answer was revealed, the answer had not been reached by the audience the show had designed it for. Either the clues were insufficient to lead logically to the conclusion the show intended, or the clues led logically somewhere other than where the show pointed. The producer's own commentary confirmed that the answer was not predetermined. From the beginning, multiple different shooters were considered. The candidates included Barney Gumble at one point, and the final choice of Maggie was made late in the process, with the clues adjusted retroactively to accommodate it. The mystery was reverse engineered. The answer was chosen and the evidence was adjusted to fit the answer, rather than the answer emerging from the evidence that had already been laid. Now look at the specific evidence the show presents for Maggie's guilt. The sundial? Burns falling with his hands pointing at letters that can be read as the initials of his attacker. The episode leans heavily on this as its central physical clue, the dramatic image that is supposed to make the reveal feel earned rather than arbitrary. But Burns himself stated explicitly, within the episode, that the placement of his hands was not intentional. He did not position himself to point at letters. He fell and his hands landed where they landed. The show's primary piece of physical evidence for Maggie's guilt was declared meaningless by the victim. Burns said it was a coincidence. The single most dramatic clue in the mystery's presentation was explicitly labeled as not a clue by the only person positioned to know whether it was meaningful, the gun. Burns was carrying a firearm in a holster. Shortly before the shooting, the holster is shown empty. Burns's gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. The shooter used Burns's own weapon, which means the shooter did not bring a gun to the meeting. They were not armed in advance. They were not planning to shoot anyone when they left their home that evening. They encountered Burns's gun by chance or by proximity and used it in a moment of opportunity or impulse rather than premeditation. This significantly narrows the meaningful suspect pool. Most of the people at the meeting who were shown carrying weapons had brought them from home. They arrived armed because they were angry enough to have come prepared for violence. The shooter was someone who was not armed, who encountered the gun and used it, which means they had not come specifically prepared to kill Burns. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile completely, but so does almost any unarmed adult who was present that night. Burns's last words before being shot, in the reconstruction the episode presents, were a phrase indicating recognition. He acknowledged his attacker. He said something equivalent to, "Oh, it is you." The phrasing of familiar recognition, the greeting you give to someone you know when you encounter them unexpectedly. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson well enough to offer that greeting? Has Burns ever had a meaningful interaction with Maggie before this moment? The show does not establish a relationship between Burns and the Simpson baby. Burns famously cannot remember Homer's name, and Homer works directly for him. The idea that Burns would recognize and calmly acknowledge a baby he has no documented relationship with, that the greeting he offered his attacker has the quality of recognizing a specific person rather than simply noticing that there is a child present, does not sit easily with everything the show has established about how Burns's recognition of other people works. But Burns did have a meaningful emotional connection to Marge. In an earlier episode, Burns developed a genuine infatuation with Marge Simpson. It was played as comedy. Burns's courtship methods were entirely inappropriate. The whole storyline was clearly going nowhere, but the show established that Burns had real feelings for Marge, feelings that existed within his extremely limited emotional vocabulary as something close to attachment. He remembered her. He was drawn to her. If Burns looked into the face of his shooter and said, "Oh, it is you," with the calm recognition of encountering someone he cared about, the person whose face could produce that response was Marge. The Marge shooter theory is the most carefully constructed alternate reading of the evidence, and it extends beyond the identification question. Marge had watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, and cover her town in darkness. She had watched her husband come home humiliated from work for years, the same employer who could never remember his name, the same man who had been systematically diminishing Homer's dignity for decades. She had every reason to want Burns stopped. And if Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot and the gun went off, and he fell and woke up in a hospital room with a clear understanding of what had happened, he had a choice. Identify the real shooter or protect her. The theory proposes that Burns, for perhaps the only time in his documented existence, acted on something other than self-interest. He had feelings for Marge. When he came around in the hospital, he understood what had happened and who had done it, and what identifying her would mean for her and her family. He looked at the sundial. He let the town interpret the letters however it wanted to. And when the investigation produced a candidate who could not be prosecuted, a baby who was legally immune from consequence, Burns confirmed it, because the confirmation cost him nothing and protected the one person in Springfield he had ever cared about in any form. Then there is Homer's confession. In season 18, Homer states on screen that he was the one who shot Burns. He simply says it, out loud, in a regular episode. Not as a cliffhanger, not as a reveal, as a throwaway line that nobody in the scene reacts to with anything other than indifference. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield has been shot, and a person in a regular episode has just confessed to it, and the show's response is to treat the confession as background noise. Homer's confession is either a lie entirely consistent with his established pattern of taking credit for things he did not do when doing so serves some immediate social purpose, or it is true, and the show has been carrying the actual answer in a throwaway line in season 18 for anyone willing to hear it. The alternate endings are perhaps the most direct evidence that the mystery's resolution was never truly settled. A complete alternate version of the resolution was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. Fully produced, fully voiced. It exists as a finished piece of film. The show addressed it in a clip show hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses the Smithers ending by noting that accepting it would require ignoring all the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, in his words, downright nutty. And then Troy McClure, in the same breath, draws an explicit comparison to the O.J. Simpson trial, where a jury had done exactly that, had considered DNA evidence and reached a verdict that did not follow from it. The show is telling you directly that evidence can be made to point wherever those with power need it to point, that the official answer and the correct answer are not necessarily the same thing, that juries, like towns, make decisions based on more than evidence. And that in Springfield, as in the real world, the person who ends up accountable for a crime is not always the person who committed it. The final shot of part 2 shows Maggie alone in the room after everyone else has gone. She checks her surroundings to confirm that no one is watching, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as a silent confession. Maggie knows what she did, and she is performing it privately in the moment of her solitude. But there is another reading. A baby witnessed someone shoot Burns in a parking lot. She watched an adult perform that specific motion. She saw it happen. And now, alone in a quiet room, she is doing what babies do when they absorb something they do not fully understand, replaying it, practicing it. The way a child mimics the actions of adults before the meaning of those actions has fully resolved into understanding. She is not confessing. She is remembering. She saw someone shoot Burns. She is playing back the memory with the only physical vocabulary available to her. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was closed. The show committed to an answer, and the writers stand behind it, and the DVD commentary treats it as settled. But the contest that no one won, the clues that Burns himself described as coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully animated and never destroyed, Homer's unexamined confession in season 18, and the final image of a baby with a pacifier mimicking a gun in an empty room, none of it sits cleanly. In Springfield, a closed case and a solved case have always been very different things. Section 4, The Immortality of Mr. Burns. How old is Mr. Burns? The question is more difficult to answer than it should be, and the difficulty is itself revealing. His birth has been placed by various episodes in the late 1800s. He has spoken about personal memories of events from before the turn of the 20th century with the texture of first-hand experience rather than historical knowledge passed down through family stories. He served in World War II. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He has referenced the Gilded Age as something he lived inside, rather than something he read about. He has mentioned the Spanish-American War in a register that implies he observed it rather than studied it. By the most conservative reading of the show's timeline, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the more expansive readings that take his historical references at full face value, he may be approaching 140. And he does not simply exist at this age in the way that very elderly people exist, reduced, diminished, dependent on care for the basic functions of daily life. Burns functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation whose operational complexity requires sustained executive intelligence. He manipulates municipal politics with a sophistication that demands long-term strategic thinking and the ability to manage multiple competing interests simultaneously. He orchestrates schemes that span months and require not just intelligence but patience, the kind of patience that comes from having a longer view of time than anyone around you, from understanding that plans can be maintained across years if the planner has the lifespan to wait for them to mature. His physical form is fragile in ways the show plays for consistent comedy. His body has almost no strength. Stairs present genuine challenges. A light breeze has been depicted as potentially dangerous. He is brittle in every physical dimension, but his mind is something entirely different. Burns is arguably the most strategically capable character in Springfield, operating with a ruthless precision that nobody else in the town's population can approach. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained cognitive function. The mechanism of his survival is addressed directly in the Springfield Files, though it is addressed in a way designed to redirect the audience's attention from its implications toward its comedic surface. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with radiation therapy and experimental pharmaceutical compounds, that it causes his body to produce a visible green glow. The treatment sustains him for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he would die within 7 days. The margin for error is 0. His life is maintained on a schedule the way industrial equipment is maintained on a service schedule through regular, precisely timed intervention, the continuous management of systems that would fail catastrophically without it. The treatment keeps him alive by managing something. The show does not specify exactly what is being managed, but the implication across multiple episodes taken together, assembled from the scattered evidence the show deposits without comment, is that Burns's body is in a state of managed crisis. His biological systems are not functioning the way healthy biological systems function. They are not declining the way aging biological systems typically decline. They are being held in a specific state through artificial intervention, and that intervention requires radiation, which means the man who owns the nuclear plant is not just profiting from its output, he is dependent on it. Burns and the plant are not separate entities with a financial relationship. They are the same organism. The doctors who inform Burns that he has every disease known to medical science, the famous Three Stooges syndrome scene that has been quoted more times than almost any other moment in the show's run, are describing, from a clinical angle, the same system. Burns's body contains every illness simultaneously, and the illnesses exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each one blocks every other one from progressing. They are all trying to kill him at once, and none of them can succeed because each one is being prevented by all the others. The doctor describes it as the sickest possible body that is functionally impossible to kill through conventional illness progression. This is played as one of the show's great absurdist comedy moments. But if you take the radiation and immortality theories seriously, the scene is describing something precise. The weekly treatments do not cure Burns's diseases. They could not. There are too many of them, and his body is too far past the point where curative medicine has any traction. What the treatments do is maintain the equilibrium. They act as a kind of biological control system, keeping every illness in the calibrated stasis that prevents any single one from gaining momentum. The treatments are not medicine in any conventional framework. They are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods in a nuclear reactor to prevent a meltdown. Burns's body is the reactor. His diseases are the reaction. The treatments keep the reaction controlled. Without the treatments, the control rods come out, and everything surges simultaneously toward criticality. Smithers in this framework is not primarily a devoted assistant or an emotionally complex figure orbiting Burns out of complicated affection, though all of that is also true. Smithers is the single most operationally critical person in Burns's continued existence. He manages Burns's schedule. He ensures Burns makes every appointment, every treatment session, every medical intervention that his survival requires. He monitors Burns's physical condition with the vigilance of someone who understands that the monitoring is not administrative but existential. The show has established across decades of episodes that if Smithers truly left, permanently Burns would be helpless within a specific and very short time frame. Not emotionally helpless, medically helpless. Without Smithers scheduling the treatments, Burns would miss a dose. The equilibrium would collapse, every disease would surge. The scenario the doctor described the Three Stooges trying to get through the door simultaneously would resolve because the door would finally come off its hinges. Smithers keeps Burns alive through logistics. He knows this. The show implies that this knowledge is foundational to their dynamic in ways that the explicit content of the show never fully unpacks, but consistently suggests. Smithers is devoted to Burns for reasons that include emotional attachment, but extend beyond it into something closer to professional caretaking at an existential level. He is the person standing between Burns and the specific week in which nothing is scheduled and everything fails. Burns's relationship to historical events adds a layer to the immortality question that the show builds up gradually and never draws together into a single moment of explicit statement. The things Burns has been depicted experiencing firsthand, across the scattered evidence of multiple episodes, represent an extraordinary span of American history. He was present for events that span from the Gilded Age through the present day. He was not just alive during these periods, he was active. He was making decisions, managing his fortune, maintaining his position, accumulating the resources and connections that would allow him to continue functioning indefinitely. The Burns family history, as the show establishes it, extends this question further back and makes it more pointed. The Burns dynasty is described as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. Their wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, which is itself a remarkable claim. It means the Burns family did not accumulate their fortune during the period when American wealth was primarily created. They were already wealthy when that era began. Their fortune has been in continuous operation across a span of time that encompasses the founding of the country, through every war and recession and social transformation that followed. That kind of continuity does not happen through normal generational wealth transfer. Fortunes fragment through inheritance. They erode through mismanagement, through taxation, through the simple entropy that disperses concentrated wealth over generations, unless actively and intelligently managed. The Burns fortune has not eroded, it has grown. The Burns family has maintained continuous control of their accumulated resources for longer than the American Republic has existed. Either this represents luck on a scale that defies any reasonable probability calculation, or it represents a different kind of explanation, one that involves methods of extending individual control across generational timescales that normal biology does not accommodate. The current Burns has been alive for over a century through artificial means. The theory asks whether previous Burns patriarchs employed different but analogous methods. Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before any of the technology that currently sustains Burns through his weekly treatments, were there other approaches? Other systems for managing the entropy that normally reduces powerful men to powerless old age and eventually to nothing? The show does not answer this. It does not need to. The question it has raised by establishing the dynasty's impossible continuity is sufficient. Something has been maintaining the Burns family's control across centuries. Whatever that something is in the current Burns, the weekly glowing treatments and the carefully managed disease equilibrium, it is presumably the latest iteration of a practice that has been running since before anyone now living was born. Burns has come close to dying more often than almost any other character on the show. He was shot by Maggie and survived. He has been hospitalized dozens of times for conditions that would be terminal in anyone whose medical infrastructure was less comprehensive. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been abandoned in situations that should have been fatal. And every time, the machine catches him. The infrastructure of wealth and medical access, and the logistical competence of the one person who knows how to keep the machine running, all of it assembles around Burns every time he approaches the edge and pulls him back. Homer's immortality is passive. He survives things because the show needs him to. Burns's immortality is engineered. Burns has spent a century constructing a system specifically designed to ensure his survival, regardless of what his body goes through. Every institution he has ever owned, every politician he has ever purchased, every doctor he has ever retained, all of it serves a single operational purpose. Keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the system that has been running Springfield for 100 years has to answer for what it has done to the people inside it. And a system does not allow itself to answer for anything if it can avoid it. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot function without Burns. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean accountability. And the first law of power is that accountability is always avoidable if you have lived long enough to build enough infrastructure around yourself. He is too expensive to die, and Springfield will keep paying the bill, 1 week at a time indefinitely. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper. How Springfield Chooses Its Lies. Most people who care about The Simpsons have a strong opinion about the episode called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired on the 28th of September, 1997, in the 9th season, and the backlash was immediate and sustained and has, by any honest accounting, never fully subsided. 28 years after the original broadcast, this episode is still cited in conversations about where the show went wrong. It is ranked among the worst episodes the series has produced. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner among a large portion of the supporting cast, stated publicly that he found the storyline objectionable. Critics at the time and retrospectively have described it as the moment the show stopped respecting its own continuity, the moment the writers demonstrated that no aspect of the world they had built was safe from revision in service of a single episode's premise. The premise is this: Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony honoring Principal Skinner's 20 years of service. During the ceremony, a stranger walks in and introduces himself as the real Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, was presumed dead, survived, escaped, and came home to find that someone else had been living his name and his life for 2 decades. The imposter's real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street-level criminal with no prospects and no stable identity. He was drafted into the army, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian came to Springfield to inform his mother. Agnes Skinner, seeing Tamzarian, assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never belonged anywhere, who had never had a family or a home or a name worth keeping, made the decision in that moment that would define the next 20 years. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the history, the relationship with Agnes, the position at the school. He maintained the fiction for 2 decades. He became, over time, the only Skinner Springfield had known or would know until the original walked back through the door. Springfield holds a town meeting. Everyone is present. The truth is fully documented and undeniable. And the town votes, not on how to address what has been revealed, not on what justice requires or what honesty demands, on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote is unanimous. They choose to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree declaring that Armin Tamzarian is and will legally be considered the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the man with documentation of his real identity, the man whose name was taken while he was surviving captivity, is physically tied to a railroad car and expelled from Springfield. The judge makes it explicitly illegal to refer to what was revealed as true under penalty of punishment. The truth is not just rejected, it is criminalized. The truth teller is not just disbelieved, he is physically removed from the community. And Springfield goes home for dinner. The fan response was furious. The critical response was furious. The episode was treated as a betrayal as the show willfully destroying a character whose depth and history had been built with care across 8 seasons, replacing the complexity of Skinner's background with an arbitrary retcon that made everything about him fictional. The military service? Fake. The relationship with Agnes? Built on a deception. the authority he carried as principal, exercised under a stolen identity. Everything that had made Skinner a character worth watching reduced to a lie someone told in a moment of weakness that nobody had the courage to undo. But here is the thing that the critics of the episode have never fully engaged with. The episode is not lazy writing. The episode is the most honest thing The Simpsons has ever said about Springfield. Every instance of Springfield choosing comfort over truth, every reset after a catastrophe, every moment of collective amnesia that allows the town to return to normal after something that should have changed everything. Those moments have always been the invisible machinery of the show. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode that makes the machinery visible. It puts the vote on screen. It gives the mechanism a procedural form. It shows you the legal decree, the physical expulsion, the explicit criminalization of inconvenient truth. Every other time Springfield forgets something it should remember, it happens off-screen between episodes, handled by the show's production logic without being depicted as a choice. This episode is the only time the choice is depicted in real time, and the audience reacted as though they were seeing something new. They were not seeing something new. They were seeing what had always been there, finally stated plainly. Springfield has always operated through collective denial. The town has always chosen the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. It has always agreed, through some unspoken social contract, to forget whatever threatens the stability of the agreed-upon version of reality. The power plant has been demonstrably poisoning the community for decades, and nobody has connected the evidence to the cause. A baby shot the richest man in town, and the investigation ended at a verdict that everyone found convenient. A man who cannot remember his longtime employee's name has been running the town's economy for a century, and the town has accepted this as simply how things are. Springfield's relationship with truth has always been conditional, pragmatic, and ultimately governed by the question, what version of reality can we afford to accept? The Principal and the Pauper puts the answer to that question in the form of a vote, and the vote is unanimous, and the show has the nerve to show you the unanimity without blinking. This is not the show being lazy about continuity. This is the show telling you, with unusual directness, that continuity in Springfield is not a matter of what actually happened. It is a matter of what the community has agreed to say happened. Think about the full scope of what this means for everything the show has depicted across its run. The Springfield Dome. When the EPA contained the town under a glass dome in the Simpsons movie, it was a definitive, federal-level acknowledgement that the environmental contamination in Springfield had reached catastrophic levels. A real agency of the United States government looked at this town and said the only proportionate response was physical containment. That should have been the event that changed everything, that forced the community to reckon with the plant, with burns, with the decades of accumulated damage. And by the next episode, it was as if it had never happened. Springfield reset. The dome was gone. The contamination was not addressed. The crisis that had required federal quarantine was not referenced. Under the Principal and the Pauper theory, this is not a production failing. It is not the writers failing to maintain continuity. It is Springfield doing what Springfield does. The community looked at what the dome implied, what acknowledging the dome would require them to acknowledge, and voted to proceed as though it had not happened. The vote was not explicit this time. It was the silent, distributed version of the same social contract. Everyone understood that talking about the dome would lead somewhere they could not afford to go, so no one talked about it, and the agreed-upon version of reality moved forward without it. If you acknowledge the dome, you would have to acknowledge the contamination. If you acknowledge the contamination, you would have to confront the plant. If you confronted the plant, you would have to challenge Burns. If you challenged Burns, the economy he controls would be disrupted in ways the town might not survive. If you acknowledge the three-eyed fish, you would have to acknowledge what the same water is doing to the people who drink it. If you acknowledged what the water is doing to the people, you would have to acknowledge what the people look like, and what the people looking like that means for how long it has been happening, and who knew, and when they knew, and what they chose to do about it. The chain of acknowledgement, once started, does not stop at a comfortable place, so Springfield does not start it. The social contract says that the chain stays unstarted, that the first link is never pulled, that the truth that would begin the unraveling is treated as something that happened in a different universe where the rules are different. Springfield forgets because remembering is the most dangerous thing it could do. And anyone who insists on remembering anyone who shows up with evidence that the agreed-upon version is false, who stands in the meeting hall and holds up a three-eyed fish and says something is wrong here, look at this gets the Skinner treatment. They get tied to a train. They get expelled. They get made illegal. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with irrefutable proof that the official narrative was built on a lie. He was a man whose existence alone constituted a challenge to the community's preferred version of events. And the community's response was not investigation or justice or even simple acknowledgement. It was removal. The truth teller was physically extracted from the community, and the truth was made criminal. That is how Springfield maintains its impossible reality. Through consensus, through the active, deliberate, voted-upon enforcement of the agreed-upon version of events. Not through passive forgetting, not through cognitive damage alone, not through the fog of radiation or the reset mechanics of a dreaming mind, though all of those things are also present. Through choice, Springfield chooses what it remembers and what it forgets, and it enforces those choices through the full weight of its social and legal structures. The principle and the pauper is not the moment The Simpsons went wrong. It is the moment The Simpsons showed you, clearly and without softening, what Springfield has always been, a community that decided long ago that the truth is a luxury it cannot afford, and that anyone who insists on offering it anyway will be shown the railroad. Section 6. Maggie Simpson. The Strategy of Silence. Maggie Simpson does not speak. This is the defining fact of her character, the thing that separates her from every other member of the Simpson family and from almost every other character in a show populated by people who talk constantly, loudly, and without much filter between thought and word. Homer narrates his own inner life at volume. Marge processes her anxieties out loud, in the ongoing worried murmur that provides the show's emotional floor. Bart provokes, performs, announces himself in every room he enters. Lisa argues, lectures, analyzes, and describes her interior world with a precision that sometimes feels less like self-expression and more like an ongoing effort to make the world around her understand what it is experiencing. The Simpson household is a wall of continuous human noise, and in the center of it, Maggie sits, watching, thinking, processing, silent. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk without falling. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional gesture that requires attention to interpret. She has not developed language in any sustained way across nearly 800 episodes of a show. Her first word, daddy, spoken once, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in what amounted to a special occasion cameo, was announced in advance as a significant event, treated as a milestone, and then never repeated. Maggie said daddy once and went back to silence, and the show moved forward as if the silence were developmental and the word were a curiosity rather than evidence of capability. The developmental reading of Maggie's silence is simple and almost universally accepted. She is a baby, and babies do not speak. The show is being accurate to the age it has assigned her. The comedy of her occasional moments of unexpected capability lies in the contrast between her infant presentation and the actions that reveal the presentation to be incomplete. But the theory of Maggie's silence is not that it is developmental. The theory is that it is strategic, that Maggie Simpson does not speak because she has decided not to, because she has been watching this family and this town for 36 years with an intelligence that has had nothing to do but observe, and what she has observed has led her to a conclusion about the value of visibility that is the opposite of the conclusion her sister reached. Begin with the shooting, because it is the act most people associate with Maggie, and because the aftermath of the shooting, examined carefully, reveals something specific about how Maggie processes the world around her. Whatever actually happened in the parking lot outside the town meeting and the previous section has established that the official version of events has significant gaps in it. The consequence of the shooting for Maggie was 0. A baby was identified as having shot the most powerful man in Springfield. The case was investigated. The evidence was weighed. The conclusion reached by the legal system was that nothing could be done about it. Chief Wiggum's analysis: no jury in the world would convict a baby, and that was the end of it. Maggie committed, or was accused of committing, an act of violence against the wealthiest and most influential person in her community, and her protection from consequence was total and automatic. Not because of legal sophistication or strategic planning or any active defense she mounted, Because she is a baby, and being a baby places her beneath the threshold at which the community's systems of accountability operate, she is invisible to those systems. Too young to be noticed, too small to be suspected, too silent to be a threat. In the final shot of part 2 of the Burns shooting, after everyone has left the hospital room, Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully. She confirms that no one is watching, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show wants this read as confirmation as Maggie's private acknowledgement of what she did, performed only when she is certain no audience is present. But the motion is also describable as something a baby does after witnessing an event she does not fully understand. Replication. Children replicate what they observe. They practice the motions of adults before the meaning of those motions has fully resolved. Whether Maggie is confessing or remembering, the choice to do either thing only in confirmed privacy reveals something. She waited. She checked. She performed the action only after ensuring there were no witnesses. That sequence requires situational awareness, environmental assessment, impulse control, and an understanding of consequence sophisticated enough to produce caution. These are not characteristics of a baby operating at a 1-year-old cognitive level. The 2012 theatrical short, The Longest Daycare, is the most concentrated piece of evidence for the theory of Maggie's intelligence, and it operates almost entirely without words, which means it operates in the register Maggie herself operates in. Maggie is left at a daycare facility run with institutional rigidity. She encounters a caterpillar in the process of metamorphosis. Another baby, a bully, wants to destroy it. Maggie wants to protect it. What follows is 7 minutes of Maggie systematically outmaneuvering every obstacle between the chrysalis and the outside world. She reads the environment with the attention of someone mapping a space for tactical purposes. She identifies the locations and movement patterns of threats, the bully, the daycare staff, the physical barriers of the facility itself, and she processes this information into a plan. The plan is not simple. It involves multiple steps that have to be executed in sequence, each one conditional on the success of the previous one. It involves predicting other people's behavior in advance, anticipating where the bully will go before he goes there, positioning herself to counter his movement before he makes it. It involves improvisation when the plan encounters unexpected obstacles, a rapid reassessment, and a new path forward without panic or hesitation. And it works. The butterfly escapes. Maggie succeeds. She does all of this without speaking, without assistance, and while being physically constrained by the motor limitations of a body that cannot yet walk reliably. Her decision-making throughout is essentially flawless. Every choice under pressure is the right one. Her body keeps failing her, she falls, she stumbles, she crawls when she needs to move quickly, and her mind compensates for every physical failure through the quality of its planning. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support, and she succeeds anyway because the intelligence is sufficient to overcome the physical limitations. The show has produced direct measurements of Maggie's intelligence through in-universe testing in various episodes, and the results are consistently described in terms like off the charts, beyond what the test can measure, or extraordinary. The show plays these moments briefly for comedy, a reveal, a laugh, a move to the next scene, and does not pause to examine their implications. But the pattern across the series is clear and deliberate. Maggie is not a normal baby. She has never been a normal baby. Every episode that touches her cognitive capabilities arrives at the same conclusion, and the show has been consistent about it for 36 years. Now look at what she has chosen to do with that intelligence. Nothing visible, nothing that draws attention, nothing that would cause the people around her to reassess what she is capable of. She maintains, with extraordinary discipline across nearly 4 decades of television, the presentation of a passive and dependent infant. She falls down in public. She needs to be carried. She makes pacifier sounds when what she is experiencing is apparently something substantially more complex than pacifier sounds can convey. She watches her family fail and recover and fail again without intervening in ways that would reveal her capability, without stepping into situations in ways that would require explanation, without drawing the attention of the people around her to the thing they have been living next to since her birth. The theory proposes that this is not absence of capability. It is the intelligent deployment of apparent incapability as a strategic resource, and the theory points to Lisa Simpson as the reason. Lisa is brilliant. The show has established this across its entire run in ways that go beyond the occasional IQ test or academic achievement. Lisa's intelligence is structural. It shapes how she sees the world, how she processes information, how she relates to the people around her. She is the smartest person in her family by a margin that is not close. She is the smartest person in Springfield by a margin that is similarly not close. And the experience of being visibly, vocally intelligent in this family and this town has been, for Lisa, the source of most of her suffering. She raises her hand and gets ignored. She offers solutions and gets dismissed. She identifies problems with clarity and precision, and the community's response is to make her feel that identifying problems is itself the problem. She challenges authority and gets punished. She fights for things she believes in and gets worn down by the resistance of a community that does not want to be improved. Lisa wears her intelligence on the outside. She announces herself. She makes herself visible, and the world around her responds to that visibility with a consistent pattern of dismissal, mockery, and exhaustion. Maggie watched this happen. She has been watching it happen since the day she was born. She has had a front-row view of what happens to the smartest person in this family, and the view is not encouraging. Lisa uses her intelligence visibly and gets crushed by a community that is not equipped to value it. Lisa keeps fighting regardless of the cost, which is admirable and also expensive, and the expense is paid in isolation and frustration, and the specific loneliness of being someone who sees clearly in a community that has voted to see nothing. Maggie learned a different lesson. Silence is power. Invisibility is armor. The less the community notices you, the more you can accomplish inside the margins of that inattention. If you appear to be exactly what everyone expects a baby to be, passive, dependent, sweet, unremarkable, then you can operate in the spaces that visible intelligence cannot access. You can do things that get attributed to coincidence or accident or luck because no one is watching you closely enough to understand that what you are doing is not any of those things. You can be the most capable person in every room you enter and have no one in the room know it. Every heroic act Maggie has performed in the show's run has happened this way, below the radar, in the margins. In the moments when the family's full attention is on whatever crisis Homer has generated or whatever cause Lisa is pursuing, she saves the family and then sits quietly while they recover without understanding how the rescue happened. She solves the problems that the adults cannot solve and then returns to the pacifier. She moves through Springfield beneath the threshold of notice that the community's attention operates at, doing things that no one-year-old should be able to do, and getting away with it because no one is watching the baby. That is exactly how Maggie designed it. Connect this to the radiation theory and the picture becomes more specific. If the contamination produces mutations that affect individuals differently, if Homer's exposure reduced his cognitive function while others in the same environment were affected differently, then Maggie and Homer represent opposite poles of the same spectrum. Homer's mutation devastated his intelligence. Maggie's amplified hers to a level the show cannot adequately measure. Same water, same air. Same parents whose biology had already been soaking in the plant's runoff for years. The father's brain was broken. The daughter's was supercharged. They are two expressions of the same environmental cause, living in the same house, separated by the full range of what radiation does to human cognitive function when it is given decades and an entire town to work with. The coma theory gives Maggie's genius a different and more tender quality. If Homer is dreaming his family from inside a hospital bed, if every episode is the product of an unconscious father trying to hold on to the people he loves, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Homer's prayer made visible. He cannot watch her grow up. He cannot be there for the milestones. He cannot teach her things or protect her or discover who she is becoming in the years the coma is stealing from both of them. So the dream makes her capable of protecting herself. The dream gives her an intelligence that transcends her age, that compensates for his absence, that ensures she will be okay even without him there. Her genius in the coma reading is not a biological mutation. It is a father's love expressed as cognitive superpower, given to his most vulnerable child by the only means available to him, the dream. But there is a darker reading that sits alongside the tender one. Maggie is waiting for something. The show has never told us what. It has never shown us her endgame. never revealed the moment she decides the preparation is complete and the silence has served its purpose, and it is time to act. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her lead a rebellion of babies against a tyrannical caretaker. We have seen her solve problems that defeated everyone else. We have seen her save her family in moments the family did not know it needed saving. We have seen her make the decisive move when every adult in the scene was too frightened or too slow or too impaired to make it. She has been watching Springfield for 36 years. She has been watching what the plant does, what Burns does, what the community's pattern of denial produces. She has been watching her father go to work every day for the man who destroyed his family, too cognitively impaired to understand the connection. She has been watching her sister fight and get worn down. She has been watching the town vote to forget, watching the resets, watching the accumulated evidence that Springfield is a contamination zone whose population is too damaged to recognize their own condition. And she has been saying nothing, waiting, planning, preparing for a moment that the show has never arrived at and that 36 years of silence has been building toward with extraordinary patience. When Maggie finally acts, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will see it coming. That is exactly how she designed it. Section 7. The predictions. What the show actually knew. The Simpsons has been accurately predicting the future. This is the claim. It arrives in the form of viral screenshots, breathless social media posts, articles with headlines calibrated to produce a specific kind of low-grade wonder in the reader. The evidence is assembled across years of fan attention and internet archaeology, and the list of apparent hits is genuinely long. The show depicted a Trump presidency 16 years before it happened. It showed a smartwatch in 1995. It imagined a global pandemic spreading from Asia in 1993. It depicted the Disney acquisition of Fox in 1998. It showed a Higgs boson calculation in 1998. It anticipated video calling, autocorrect failures, surveillance culture, the rise of celebrity politics, the specific dynamics of a dozen cultural moments that arrived years after the episode that seemed to anticipate them. The question worth asking carefully is not whether the list is real. Most of it is real. Most of the alignments exist, but what the list actually means. Because the explanation turns out to be simultaneously less mysterious and more interesting than any version of the supernatural reading. Start with the cases that make up the backbone of the phenomenon, because understanding them individually helps build the framework for understanding what the whole thing is about. The Trump episode aired in the year 2000. The episode Bart to the Future depicted a future America in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States, and the setup for the joke required establishing who her predecessor in the office had been. That predecessor was President Trump. The episode did not treat this as a dramatic prediction. It treated it as a punchline, the logical, absurd conclusion of a trend in American politics that the writers found satirically useful. Celebrity culture had been bleeding into political culture since at least the Reagan era. The idea of a famous businessman with a talent for self-promotion running for president and winning had been treated as a possibility in public discourse since Trump himself had publicly flirted with the idea in the late 1980s. The writers did not use supernatural foresight to place Trump in the Oval Office 16 years before it happened. They observed a trend, identified its most absurd possible destination, and used that destination as a joke. But when Trump actually won in 2016, the joke became a reference point. Screenshots of the episode circulated within hours. The cultural response was a specific mixture of amazement and dark recognition that the show had somehow known. The Simpsons predicted Trump became a phrase that lived independently of any engagement with the show, that traveled across social platforms and into conversations among people who had not watched an episode in years. The prediction entered cultural memory as a fact. The Disney-Fox merger episode aired in 1998. The show depicted a media corporation swallowing its competitors in a deal that maps closely onto what Disney actually did to Fox in 2019. 21 years between the joke and the event. Media consolidation had been accelerating as a visible trend throughout the 1990s. The direction that trend was heading toward fewer, larger companies controlling larger and larger shares of the media landscape was not obscure or difficult to read. The writers observed the trend and extrapolated it to its logical extreme because that is what good satire does. They were not predicting the future. They were reading the present and following the line forward. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, has addressed the prediction phenomenon with useful directness. His assessment: most of the predictions are coincidences that emerge from the show's age and the cyclical nature of history. The episodes are old enough that history has had time to repeat itself or rhyme with what the show depicted. There are very few cases where the show genuinely predicted something new. Mostly, it identified tendencies that had always been present in American culture, depicted their exaggerated versions, and waited for American culture to catch up to the exaggeration. The show's writing staff, across its various eras and creative periods, has been one of the most formally educated in American television. Multiple writers hold advanced degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other institutions whose curricula tend to produce people capable of reading trends with the kind of systematic attention that enables careful extrapolation. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, the sciences, economics, and political theory. These are not people guessing at random. They are intelligent, well-read observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying the patterns in how things change and where those changes are heading. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer since the earliest seasons, offers the probability argument. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. The show has produced close to 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations about culture, technology, politics, and social dynamics. When you generate that volume of content over that span of time, statistical probability alone ensures that some of it will align with future events. This is not a remarkable phenomenon. It is arithmetic. Fact-checking organizations that have examined the most popular prediction claims have consistently found that the alignments are either less precise than the viral versions present them, or are explicable as trend extrapolation, or rest on selective memory of the happenings and convenient forgetting of the misses. Nobody screenshots the Simpsons jokes that did not come true. Nobody builds theories around the predictions that failed. The show made jokes about jetpacks, about moon colonies, about technological developments and political outcomes that went the other direction entirely. Those jokes are not in the compilation videos. The hits are in the compilation videos, and the compilation videos look like prophecy because the misses have been edited out. The Nanimus, he confirmation bias operating at scale. We remember the times the show appeared to foresee the future. We forget the much larger number of times it did not. And when you filter 800 episodes of satirical content through the lens of only remembering what turned out to be accurate, the result is a highlight reel that looks supernatural to anyone who does not know about the size of the underlying sample. This is the reasonable, defensible, accurate explanation for the prediction phenomenon. And it is the right explanation for most of the cases on the list. But here is where it becomes genuinely interesting, because the reasonable explanation does not account for all of the cases with equal elegance. Some of the alignments are not thematically accurate in a general sense that could be attributed to trend extrapolation. They are specific in ways that resist the statistical argument without quite crossing into the inexplicable. The Trump episode did not just observe the general possibility of celebrity becoming president. It named Trump specifically, and it depicted him descending an escalator, a visual detail that mirrors with uncomfortable precision the announcement Trump made in 2015 at Trump Tower, which specifically featured him descending on an escalator. That level of specificity sits differently than a general observation about the direction of celebrity politics. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just make a joke about the danger of performing with exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a way that maps closely onto the specific event in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. The details align in ways that go beyond the general trend toward the particular event. The Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra episode is perhaps the most peculiar case on the list. In 1996, the show depicted Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra for their concert. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. There is no trend that predicted this specific collaboration. There is no cultural trajectory that a smart observer of American music in 1996 could have followed to this particular outcome. It is a highly specific joke about a highly unlikely pairing that became a highly specific real event 28 years later. The statistical argument handles this less comfortably than it handles the Disney merger or the Trump presidency. This is where the meta theory enters, and the meta theory is more interesting than the conspiracy theory because it does not require anything supernatural. The Simpsons does not predict the future. In a specific and documentable sense, The Simpsons shapes the future not through prophecy, not through the writers having access to information others do not, but through the mechanism of cultural influence at scale. The show has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. 2 generations of viewers have absorbed its observations, its jokes, its satirical readings of American culture as part of the background of how they understand the world. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream and becomes part of the frame through which millions of people process subsequent information about Trump's political ambitions. The joke does not predict the event. The joke makes the event feel familiar when it arrives. It primes the cultural imagination for the outcome. When Trump actually won, the response in large portions of the culture was not simply shock. It was shock mixed with a specific feeling of dark recognition, of having been here before, of having seen this coming in some form. That feeling of recognition had a source. The Simpsons had put the image there years earlier. The show had made the idea of a Trump presidency part of the cultural landscape, had given it a specific form, had made it feel like something that existed in the world even before it existed in the world. When the reality arrived, it arrived into a cultural environment that had already partially accommodated it. The show did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. The show made media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as obvious satire, as the kind of thing that was already basically true even when it was technically still fiction. When the merger actually happened, the cultural response was muted in a way that a development of that scale might not have been without decades of the show treating it as foregone. The Simpsons had been normalizing the outcome for 20 years. The normalization made the outcome feel less like news and more like the completion of something already in progress. Springfield does not reflect America. America has been slowly becoming Springfield. The show held up a mirror, and the culture stared into it for long enough that it started to resemble what it saw. The corrupt billionaire running the town's essential infrastructure. The nuclear plant with safety violations that nobody addresses. The government that is too compromised to protect the people it nominally serves. The population too distracted and too cognitively impaired, metaphorically, in the show's satirical framework to understand the scale of what is being done to them. The endless cycle of catastrophe, reset, and resumed normalcy where the same mistakes keep happening because no one in the system has any incentive to prevent them. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was in 1989. The show documented it in cartoon form. And then America, having been shown the diagnosis in entertaining and digestible packaging for 36 years, grew into the image. The prediction phenomenon tells you something true about The Simpsons, but not the thing the viral screenshots suggest it tells you. It tells you that the show's writers were accurate readers of American culture, that they were paying careful attention to the directions things were moving in, that they had the education and the analytical frameworks to extrapolate those directions further forward than most commentators were willing to go, because comedy gives you permission to follow an idea to its most extreme logical conclusion without being held responsible for the conclusion. Satire is a way of saying the unsayable by calling it a joke, and sometimes the joke takes 20 years to find the reality it was pointing at. The predictions are not supernatural. The predictions are what happens when a brilliantly staffed show runs for long enough, produces enough content, and is then filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever created. The predictions look like prophecy. They are something more interesting. They are accurate observation, at scale, over time, by people who were paying attention when most of the audience was too entertained to notice what the show was actually saying about the world they were living in. Section 8 Mona Simpson and the 3 Generations Burns Destroyed. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the established fact of his backstory. Abe Simpson told Homer that his mother passed away when he was young. There was a grave. Homer had grown up with the specific grief of a child who lost his mother before he was old enough to understand the loss, raised by a father who dealt with his own feelings about the marriage's end. By closing the subject entirely, and presenting Homer with a version of events that was simple and final and false. Homer's mother was dead. That was who Homer was, a man shaped by maternal absence, by the specific hole that kind of lost leaves in a person's emotional architecture. In season 7, the show revealed that the foundation was a lie. The episode Mother Simpson aired the 19th of November, 1995. Homer discovers through municipal records that his mother is alive. The grave Abe showed him belonged to Walt Whitman. Abe had been directing his son to mourn at a famous poet's headstone for Homer's entire life, maintaining the deception through the sheer force of never discussing it. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave without knowing he is still alive. Their reunion is one of the most emotionally honest scenes the show has produced across its entire run. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belonged to neither of them. And then Mona tells him why she left. The story begins in 1969. Mona was a housewife, married to Abe, with a young son named Homer, living a quiet life in Springfield while the country outside was burning through the civil rights movement and Vietnam, and a counterculture that was rewriting what it meant to be American. Something changed in her. She was radicalized by what she was seeing, not in the violent, cartoonish version of radicalization, but in the quieter version. The version where an ordinary person looks at what powerful people are doing to vulnerable ones and decides she cannot continue being ordinary about it. She joined a group of activists. They identified a target, a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Not the nuclear power plant, a germ warfare facility. A laboratory whose purpose was the development of weaponized pathogens, operating in the same town where families were raising children without any knowledge that the richest man in Springfield was manufacturing biological weapons down the road from their homes. The group broke in. They deployed what the episode describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological agents stored in the facility without harming people, to render the weapons inert. During the operation, the blast accidentally cured the asthma of the security guard on duty. That security guard was Clancy Wiggum, who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid was successful. The weapons were destroyed, and then Mona made a single mistake. As the group fled, she stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos of the evacuation. She reached down to help them. She looked at their face. The person she had stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face clearly enough to identify her. He reported her to the FBI, and from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact Abe or explain to Homer what had happened. She could not call, could not write anything that would survive the surveillance she was under, could not do anything that would lead Burns or the FBI to her family. She went to Homer's room one last time. He was asleep. She kissed him. She left. Homer woke up the next morning and his mother was gone, and Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent the next 27 years believing he was a boy whose mother had chosen in the most final way possible not to stay. That belief shaped everything about who Homer became. The desperation for love and approval that has been part of Homer's characterization since the first episode, the clinginess with Marge, the compulsive need to be liked by people who are not treating him well, the willingness to endure humiliation rather than risk the loss of connection. All of it is the specific emotional architecture of a person who was abandoned at an age when abandonment by a parent becomes the lens through which all subsequent relationships are understood. Homer did not develop insecure attachment as an adult. He was handed it at age 6 when his mother vanished, and no one told him why. The conspiracy that the theory builds from this begins with a specific observation. Burns did not just cause Mona to flee. Burns engineered the person Homer became. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would develop exactly the psychological profile that makes him the most useful possible employee for a dangerous facility that needs an incompetent and non-confrontational safety inspector. Desperate for approval, terrified of abandonment, incapable of challenging authority because challenging authority risks the one thing that feels worse than any working condition: being alone. Homer does not stay at the plant because he cannot find better work. Homer stays at the plant because the plant is where his security lives, and his security lives there because Burns made sure Homer would need it. The connection between Burns and Homer's mother was present in the show long before Homer understood it. Homer worked for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns for his entire adult life. Homer's paycheck comes from the man who destroyed his family and who has been, since Homer was 6 years old, the single most consequential force in shaping the person Homer became. When Homer learns this, when the connection is laid out clearly, as it is in Mother Simpson and in subsequent episodes, he does not connect the dots in a way that produces action. He does not confront Burns. He does not resign. He does not even appear to fully process the relationship between the man who signs his checks and the man who stole his mother. The show plays this not as comedy but as tragedy, because Homer's inability to make that connection is not laziness or stupidity in the ordinary sense. It is the accumulated result of decades of cognitive erosion from the contaminated environment, from the crayon in his skull, from the 30-plus years of chemical and radiological exposure that the plant has been providing. Homer is too damaged to see the architecture of his own suffering. He lives inside it. It feels like ordinary life. The conspiracy extends to Grandpa. A later revelation confirms that Abe Simpson and Burns struck a deal at some point in Homer's adult life. Burns had committed some crime or indiscretion that Abe discovered, and in exchange for Abe's silence, Burns agreed to guarantee Homer's employment at the plant regardless of his performance. No matter how many violations Homer failed to report, no matter how many incidents he caused or missed or slept through, no matter what the documentation of his professional incompetence looked like, and the show has documented 742 specific errors, Homer would not be permanently let go. His job was protected by a private agreement negotiated between his father and his mother's persecutor, executed without Homer's knowledge, maintained through silence, and never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. Abe made a deal with the man who destroyed his family and ensured his son would spend his adult life working for that man without understanding why. The deal protected Homer in the narrowest sense. He kept his job, while delivering him more completely into Burns's orbit, more permanently into the structure that Burns had been building since the day he identified Mona's face. Homer's mother fought back against power and lost everything she had. His father made a deal with that power and buried the truth to protect something smaller than the truth deserved. Homer inherited the consequences of both choices without ever being told that either choice had been made. He has been living inside those consequences every day of his working life, going to the plant and sitting in Sector 7G and coming home to Marge and the kids, and not understanding, not being able to understand, why his life feels so heavy underneath its ordinary surface. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life, he broke Homer's potential. The show demonstrated this directly in the Season 12 episode where Homer's crayon is removed and his intelligence rises to genius level. The man Homer could have been articulate, analytical, capable of understanding the world around him exists inside him, was always inside him, has been suppressed by a combination of physical brain damage and chemical exposure and the specific psychological damage inflicted by maternal abandonment. The man Homer would have been if his mother had stayed, if Burns had not made the call, if the FBI had not come, if the kiss goodnight had been followed by a morning where she was still there. That man exists inside Homer's skull, trapped behind a crayon and 3 decades of radiation damage, and the weight of a childhood loss that was manufactured by the richest man in town for reasons that have nothing to do with Homer personally and everything to do with what Homer has been useful for. Mona died in a later season. The episode that documents her death is one of the quietest and most devastating pieces of television the show has produced. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No joke, no cutaway gag, no reset. Just a man and his mother, and the specific weight of 27 stolen years, pressing down on both of them in a quiet room in Springfield. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, running through the entire structure of the show like a river running beneath a city, there is a story about a family that was systematically broken by one man's grudge and one town's accommodation of that grudge. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe bargained and buried the truth. Homer inherited the damage and has never understood why his life feels so heavy. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken by one man's decision to pick up a phone after a woman helped him to his feet in 1969. Burns won. Burns always wins. In Springfield, the man with the money and the longevity and the infrastructure writes the rules. And the rules have always said that Homer Simpson will work at the plant until he is done with it, because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, Because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G, and Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The town without coordinates. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people worldwide can identify Springfield than can name the capital of a significant portion of the actual states in the country where the show is set. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for so long it has become a landmark rather than an emergency, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, a retirement home, 2 hospitals, a quick-service convenience store that functions as the social center of a community that should probably have more sophisticated institutions at its center, and a history of catastrophic events that would have emptied any real American town within the first decade of the show's run. It also cannot be found on any map, not because no one has tried, because the show has spent 36 years building a geography that is internally contradictory by design, and the contradictions are so comprehensive and so consistent that they cannot be accidental. Springfield has oceanfront property. In other episodes, Springfield is landlocked. It has mountain ranges in some episodes and flat terrain in others. Its climate ranges from severe winter to tropical heat, depending on which episode you are watching. It borders Ohio in one episode and Nevada in another, and Maine in a third. Its area code begins with digits suggesting Missouri. Its state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which is not a real designation in the American system. When Homer once called the state capital, the person who answered confirmed the state begins with a vowel, which eliminates about half the possibilities while leaving enough remaining that no fan has ever successfully used the clue to narrow the field to a single answer. Every time the show introduces a detail that appears to narrow the geographic possibilities, a subsequent episode introduces a detail that contradicts it. The town refuses to be located. Not through carelessness, but through active, sustained effort. The show keeps moving the target, keeps adding contradictions, keeps ensuring that the question cannot be answered with the evidence available. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Matt Groening addressed this in a 2012 Smithsonian Magazine interview by acknowledging that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up, and chose the name because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in almost every state, which means a Springfield exists within reasonable distance of most American viewers regardless of their actual location. The name is generic by design. It is a container into which any American community can be poured. For about 48 hours, fans treated this as the definitive answer. Springfield was in Oregon. The mystery was solved. Case closed. And then the show continued airing episodes that placed Springfield in geographic contexts impossible to reconcile with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's statement. The mysteries continued. The contradictions were not resolved into the Oregon framework. The official answer turned out to be a truce that expired almost immediately, as though the show itself, or the people who made it, understood that Springfield's unlocatability was more valuable as an ongoing condition than as a resolved question. The surface explanation for all of this is the one the show's creative team has articulated repeatedly, and that Groening has confirmed. Springfield is meant to be universal. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone is a show that no viewer can feel positioned outside of. The geographic impossibility is the mechanism by which Springfield achieves its universality by refusing to belong to any specific place. It belongs to all places, and every viewer can locate their own experience of American town life somewhere inside it. This is true, and it is well understood. It is the show's intentional design philosophy, and it works. Springfield does feel like everywhere. It feels like the town you grew up in regardless of where that town was, because it incorporates elements of all American towns without fully committing to any of them. But under the theories this journey has been exploring, Springfield's geographic impossibility develops a more specific and more pointed meaning. The radiation theory poses a question that is worth sitting with. If the nuclear plant's contamination has altered biology in ways that produce yellow skin and four-fingered hands, and physical invulnerability and three-eyed fish, why should geography be exempt from its effects? The contamination theory proposes that the plant has warped the biology of every living thing in its environment. If the contamination operates at a level deep enough to alter cellular structure, to disrupt the normal processes of biological development, to produce consistent, and documented mutation across an entire population and its ecosystem, why assume the physical landscape itself would be immune? Perhaps Springfield has mountains and oceans and deserts simultaneously because the contamination that has warped everything else inside the dome has also warped the space itself. Compressed geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. Created a zone where the normal rules of physical geography, like the normal rules of biology, do not apply inside the boundary that the plant's influence defines. The physical impossibility of Springfield's landscape would be, in this reading, the same phenomenon as the physical impossibility of its residents' biology. The same cause, expressing itself in different registers. The plant does not just poison the water and the air, the plant has bent the space. The coma theory offers a different explanation that requires no physical mechanism because it requires no physical reality. Homer's dreaming brain does not maintain a precise map of American geography. It maintains impressions. Fragments. The feeling of specific landscapes encountered at specific moments, mountains from a childhood road trip, ocean from a family vacation, desert from a movie, farmland from driving through the Midwest on the way to somewhere else. The dreaming mind assembles Springfield from every American landscape Homer has ever encountered, layering them on top of each other without concern for geographic logic, because the dream is not trying to be a map. The dream is trying to feel like home. And home, in the experience of the person dreaming it, is not a specific geographic location. It is an accumulation of every place that ever felt safe or familiar or like a place where someone was waiting for you. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and incomplete and held together by longing rather than cartography. The mountains and the ocean and the desert are all there because they were all present in the fragments of experience that the dreaming mind had to work with when it built the simulation. The principle and the Popper theory offers the reading that is perhaps the most politically pointed of the three. Consider what a fixed, specific, legally documented location would mean for Springfield's nuclear plant, its corporate management, its three-eyed fish and cracked cooling towers, and the 342 violations that Burns refused to address. A town with a real address in a real state is subject to that state's regulatory authority. It has a fixed jurisdiction. It has a state attorney general whose office can investigate the plant's safety record. It has consistent EPA oversight from a specific regional office that knows the facility and knows its history. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent oversight. No jurisdiction that persists from one episode to the next. The plant can leak indefinitely, and the fish can keep developing extra eyes, and the children can be born yellow with 4 fingers, and none of it can be addressed through the legal and regulatory systems that would normally apply to these conditions, because those systems require a fixed location to operate. You cannot serve a regulatory subpoena to a facility whose state of operation is perpetually contested. You cannot hold anyone accountable for environmental damage that occurred in a jurisdiction that nobody can definitively establish. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is, in this reading, the most effective regulatory shield in the history of American corporate negligence. Burns does not need to bribe regulators or suppress evidence or manage political relationships to keep the plant operating without accountability. He just needs Springfield to remain unlocatable. The geographic ambiguity does the legal work that all of his other defensive measures would otherwise have to do. In the episode Behind the Laughter, the 12th season's mockumentary about the Simpson family, Springfield's location was definitively stated. The episode said the family was from northern Kentucky. That was the answer, formally given within the show's own fiction. And then, in syndicated reruns, the stated location was changed to a different state. The answer depends on which version of the episode you are watching. Even when Springfield has a specific, stated answer, the answer is not stable. It changes depending on the platform, the version, the circumstances. The answer shifts, the truth mutates. The location refuses to stay pinned. That refusal is the whole point. Springfield is more useful as a mystery than as an answer. A town that belongs everywhere cannot be contained anywhere. And in a show about a contamination zone that has been sealed by a federal agency and whose residents display documented mutations and whose plant has been operating with hundreds of safety violations for decades, a town that cannot be located on any map cannot be held accountable for any of That Springfield floats. It has always floated. It was designed to float. And the floating serves purposes that the show's official creative reasoning only partially accounts for. Every state in America has been theorized as Springfield's location. Every theory has evidence. Every theory has contradictions. The show has spent 36 years constructing a geography that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, and it has maintained that geography with a consistency of purpose that is itself revealing. Springfield will never be located. Not because the creators cannot decide, because they decided long ago that an unlocatable Springfield is worth more than a located one, a town that belongs to everyone, that no one can shut down. That floats above accountability the way Burns floats above mortality, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the patient construction of a system designed to make accountability impossible as a structural matter, rather than through any single act of evasion. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. The Loop We Built. Bart Simpson was 10 years old on the 17th of December, 1989, the night The Simpsons first aired. Bart Simpson is 10 years old right now. In whatever year you are watching this, reading this, hearing this, he was 10 when the Berlin Wall came down, and he was 10 when the internet was born, and he was 10 through every election and recession and technological revolution and cultural transformation that the world outside Springfield has experienced across 36 years of continuous change. The world kept moving. Bart stayed 10, Lisa was 8, she is still 8. Maggie was 1, she remains 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. They remain in their mid-30s, without additional wrinkles or gray hair or any of the visible evidence that time produces in the faces of people who are actually moving through it. The family exists in a state of temporal suspension so complete, so consistent, so absolutely maintained that after 36 years, it has become the defining characteristic of the show's relationship with reality. Nobody ages. The present is always now. The family is always exactly as we left them. The production term for this is the floating timeline. It describes an approach to serialized storytelling in which the characters are anchored at fixed ages while the world around them updates to stay contemporary. The episode airing in 2025 is set in 2025, with 2025 technology and 2025 cultural references, while the characters are the same ages they were when the show began. The year flows. The characters stay fixed. It is the standard approach for long-running animated series. It is accepted by audiences as a convention of the form, no more requiring explanation than the fact that cartoon characters do not need to breathe. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions of a scale and comprehensiveness that have made the convention visible in ways it usually is not. The contradictions have become large enough that they are no longer invisible. They have started to ask questions of their own. The most documented of these contradictions is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began in the late 1980s, their history was grounded in the specific cultural world of the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. Their courtship was set against the soundtrack and fashion and social atmosphere of a specific era. The cultural references of their youth anchored them to a period that made sense for people in their mid-30s. In 1989, their formative years were the years that people their age in the real world had actually experienced as formative, but the floating timeline has dragged the present forward 3.5 decades while keeping Homer and Marge in their mid-30s. Which means their mid-30s in 2025 is not the same mid-30s as their mid-30s in 1989. If they are in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not come of age in the late 1970s. They came of age in approximately 2005, which means the cultural world of their youth is not Watergate and disco and the specific anxieties of the post-Vietnam American family. It is social media and the Iraq War and the financial crisis of 2008 and all the cultural markers of a completely different era. The show has addressed this not by maintaining the original backstory, but by rewriting it repeatedly as the timeline demands. Homer and Marge's origin story has been told and retold at least 4 times, each version placing their formative years in a different decade. They were hippies. Then they were caught in the specific cultural moment of the early 90s. Then they were hipsters navigating the early 2000s. Then they were recognizably millennial in their cultural references. The emotional truth of their relationship is consistent across all versions. They love each other. They found each other. They built something together. But the era keeps sliding forward because the characters cannot age, and the characters cannot age because the show will not let them. This means Homer and Marge do not have a stable past. Their histories are documents that get revised as needed. Their memories are unstable in the specific way that written documents are unstable, accurate to the version that currently exists, but subject to revision when circumstances change. They do not have a fixed origin. They have whichever origin the current episode requires. Now hold this against everything else we have discussed across this journey. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went unconscious in April 1993. His dream preserved his family at the ages he last knew them. His children cannot grow up because the dreaming mind that built them does not have a later version of them to reference. His wife cannot age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly as she looks in every episode. The dream is a photograph of a single moment, running on loop. The radiation theory says nobody ages because the contamination has disrupted the normal biological processes that produce aging in living organisms. The same mutation that produced yellow skin and 4 fingers and physical invulnerability has also, at some deeper cellular level, disrupted the aging mechanism itself. Springfield's residents are not just mutated, they are frozen by the mutation. The contamination produced a biological state that persists, that self-maintains, that prevents the deterioration that time normally writes into bodies. The principle and the pauper theory says nobody ages because Springfield has collectively agreed not to acknowledge the passage of time. The same social contract that allows the town to ignore the dome and the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers allows it to ignore the fact that its residents have not aged in 3.5 decades. The agreement extends to time itself. Springfield chose to stop the clock, and the clock has respected the choice. Because in Springfield, what the community agrees is true is true. The Burns immortality theory says that in Springfield's universe, aging is already negotiable for anyone with sufficient resources. Burns has been circumventing biological decay for over a century through wealth and medical infrastructure. If one person in the town has found a way to make time stand still for their own body, the concept of aging is already suspended in the reality these people share. The extraordinary has already been normalized by Burns's presence. The character's not aging is simply the logical extension of a universe in which aging is demonstrably not the universal law it appears to be. All 4 theories arrive at the same conclusion from different directions. Time does not work in Springfield. Something, the radiation, the coma, the collective denial, the infrastructure of wealth, has broken the normal flow of time for everyone inside the boundary. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a symptom of something deeper that every theory in this video names differently, but points toward the same place. The show has imagined its characters aging. It has done this on multiple occasions, in flash-forward episodes that reveal what Springfield would look like if the clock were allowed to run. In Lisa's wedding, the show advances to a future version of Springfield where Lisa is 23, engaged, living a life that the episode portrays with enough emotional specificity to feel real. The future Lisa is the person the show has always suggested she would become: intelligent, principled, isolated, searching for connection in a world that does not quite understand what to do with her. The episode demonstrates unambiguously that the show's creative imagination can accommodate aging characters. It can envision futures for these people. It can tell the story of who they would become if the timer were allowed to run. And then the episode ends. Lisa returns to 8. Bart returns to 10. The future closes. The permanent present resumes as if the glimpse had never opened. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to permit it. The glimpses are sealed immediately after they are opened, as though allowing them to persist would be dangerous in a way that the individual episode format can handle but the ongoing series cannot. This is where the mystery becomes something larger than a question about a television show's production choices. The Simpsons is the American family. It has been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie have been the family that America watches itself through for 36 years, and in that time they have become not just characters but something closer to archetypes. Homer is the American father, well-intentioned, frequently failing, deeply loved in spite of everything and sometimes because of everything. Marge is the American mother, the one who holds the structure together through the force of her patience, whose sacrifice is constant and whose recognition is insufficient, and whose love for her family persists regardless. Bart is the American child who refused to be what was expected of him. Lisa is the American child who demanded to be taken seriously and kept demanding it even when the demand was met with nothing. Maggie is the part of the American family that watches everything without saying anything, that holds the most clearly and feels the most completely, and has never been given a platform adequate to what she has observed. These archetypes cannot be allowed to age, because aging would mean ending. If Bart goes to college, the archetype of the rebellious 10-year-old boy is gone. If Lisa grows into adulthood, the archetype of the brilliant, overlooked child is gone, replaced by a brilliant adult whose struggles are different, and whose relationship to the family's dynamic is different, and whose story cannot be told inside the premise that built the show. If Homer retires and Marge is left alone in the house on Evergreen Terrace, the archetype of the American middle-class family with young children is gone. We are not ready for that. We have not been ready for it for 36 years. And there is no evidence that we are approaching readiness. We tune in every week to confirm that the family is still there, still intact, still exactly as we left them. We tune in for the couch gag and the opening credits and the specific feeling of arriving at a place you know completely, a place that has not changed while the world outside has changed in every direction. We tune in for the continuity, for the proof that some things persist. The loop is not the show's failure to evolve. The loop is the service the show provides. Springfield does not change because we need something that does not change. The Simpsons endures because we have made it endure. Every viewer who tuned in for another week, every laugh, every shared screenshot, every late-night rewatch, every theory built and debated and revised, all of it has been a vote. A vote cast in the same direction as the vote Springfield cast when the real Seymour Skinner came back. We choose the version we need. We vote for the lie that feels better than the truth. The lie that says the family is still young and the house is still full and nothing has ended. The floating timeline is not the show's thesis statement about its characters. It is the show's thesis statement about its audience. We built the loop. We tightened it year by year, season by season, episode by episode. We pressed pause in 1989 and have been holding the button down ever since. Because what releasing it means, what letting the timeline move would require us to admit, is something we are not ready to face. That the children grew up while we were watching. That the years passed. That the house on Evergreen Terrace, the house we have been going home to every Sunday night for 36 years, has never really been there. That it has always been a place we built in the imagination and agreed to maintain through the force of collective attention, the same way Springfield maintains every lie it has ever decided was more comfortable than the truth. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we said so, because we needed them to be. Because the alternative to their permanence is something we have been deferring for 36 years, and we are still not ready. So the couch gag plays, the family assembles, the credits roll, the loop tightens just a little more. Bart is 10 years old. He has always been 10 years old. He will always be 10 years old. Because in Springfield, the things that the town agrees are true stay true as long as the agreement holds. And the agreement holds as long as we keep watching. And we will keep watching because the house on Evergreen Terrace is the only house in the world where nothing ever ends, where the kids are always young, where the family is always whole, where the loop that started in 1989 keeps running, until we stop. That is Springfield. That is all of it. The contamination and the coma and the shooting that was never quite solved, and the billionaire who cannot die, and the town that votes to forget, and the baby who watches everything and says nothing, and the predictions that shaped the future they appear to describe, and the mother who had to vanish, and the town that cannot be found, and the family that cannot age. Every theory in this video is different. Everyone uses different evidence and different logic and arrives through a different path. But they all end at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield, something structural. Something that goes deeper than animation style or cartoon logic or episodic storytelling convenience. And the show has been telling you about it for 36 years, one episode at a time, in the background of the jokes, in the details nobody stops to examine. Springfield is not hiding its mysteries. It is showing them to you every single week. The yellow skin, the cooling towers, the man who glows, the baby who knows, the family that never ages, the town that never changes, the loop that never ends. It is all there. It has always been there. The show just needs you to look. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If this kept you company tonight, subscribe, it genuinely helps. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Expanded Section 1 Continuation. The contamination theory. Going deeper. There is something specific about the way the show distributes its contamination evidence that deserves attention beyond the headline items. The evidence does not arrive in dramatic revelations. It does not gather itself into a single episode that makes the argument directly and invites the viewer to evaluate it as a theory. Instead, it accumulates across decades of episodes in the way that real environmental damage accumulates, through incremental evidence that is easy to dismiss individually and impossible to dismiss collectively. Once you have assembled enough of it in one place to see the pattern, consider the way the show handles the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents versus visitors, because the consistency of this contrast across hundreds of episodes is the kind of evidence that could not survive in the canon by accident. When a guest character arrives in Springfield, a visiting celebrity, a government official, a relative from outside the town, the show draws them differently. Not just slightly differently in ways you might attribute to artistic variation, fundamentally differently, more realistic proportions, eyes positioned more accurately within the face, features that approximate actual human anatomy in ways that the permanent residents of Springfield never do. The contrast is visible in every such scene, and the show has been consistent about it for 36 years. The explanation that the show has always offered for this difference, implicitly through its production choices, is that it is a stylistic decision. Guest characters are drawn more realistically to visually distinguish them from the established cast. This is a real consideration in character design. Visual distinction is a legitimate production goal, but the stylistic explanation does not address the internal logic implication of what the visual difference produces within the show's fiction. Within the world of the show, the visual difference between Springfield residents and outsiders is not a production decision. It is a fact about the world. Outsiders look different from residents not because the animators made different choices, but because, within Springfield's reality, they are different. They come from a different environment. They carry different biology. They have not been absorbing whatever the plant has been releasing into the water and air for decades. The four-fingered hand is worth examining in particular because it is the most consistently unusual feature of Springfield's population and also the one that the show has never addressed directly. Every human character in Springfield has 4 fingers on each hand. Not 3, not 5, 4. The missing finger is not commented on by anyone within the show's universe. It is treated as simply how people look. Visitors from outside Springfield also have 4 fingers, which complicates the contamination reading. In one sense, if 4 fingers were specific to the contamination zone, visitors would have 5, but this is where the production versus fiction boundary matters. The 4 fingers are a production choice that predates the contamination theory and reflects the simplicity of early animation. But within the fiction, if you are committed to the contamination as a real element of Springfield's world, the 4 fingers are the most universal and most visible of the mutations, spread so comprehensively across the population that it has become the norm, the expected, the thing nobody notices because everyone shares it. The yellow skin operates similarly. Every Springfield resident is yellow, not a naturalistic skin tone that could be attributed to any real human population. A bright, uniform, cartoonish yellow that the show deploys consistently across every resident regardless of age, gender, family background, or duration of residence. The yellow skin is real within the show's fiction, not a stylistic choice. The characters perceive each other as having normal skin. It is only from outside the show's frame of reference, from the viewer's position, that the yellow is visible as unusual. The characters themselves do not register it because it is normal to them, because they have never seen a different color skin in their immediate environment, because the contamination that produced it did so before any of them were born and has maintained it across every generation that has lived and been born inside the zone since the plant began operating. This is how environmental normalization works in real communities. The thing that is being done to you becomes, over sufficient time and across sufficient generations, simply the way things are. The baseline shifts. The before and after is invisible when you were born after and have never experienced before. Springfield's residents do not see the yellow because they have never known anything else. The contamination predates their consciousness of their own condition, and so their condition feels like normalcy because it is all the normalcy they have ever had access to. The luminous rats deserve more attention than they typically receive in discussions of the contamination evidence because they are one of the most specific and in some ways most alarming pieces of evidence in the show's catalog: rats that glow in the dark. Rats whose fur has absorbed enough radioactive material through sustained proximity to the facility's pipes and walls and ventilation systems that the material has become part of their biology, visible under low light as a faint luminescence. These rats are not kept in a controlled environment. They are running through the facility's infrastructure, through the walls, through the floors, through the ventilation systems that circulate air through the building and connect the building's internal atmosphere to its external environment. The luminous rats are not contained. They are part of the plant's daily operation, moving through it freely, carrying their radioactive signatures through every space the facility contains, and those spaces connect to the outside world. The ventilation systems exhaust to the external environment. The drainage systems connect to the water table. The structural leaks in the cooling towers release material directly into the atmosphere surrounding the facility. The luminous rats are the most visible evidence of how thoroughly the radioactive material has saturated the environment inside the plant, but they are also the most direct demonstration of how freely that environment communicates with the environment outside its walls. Burns understands all of this, not theoretically, not as a matter of general awareness, but operationally. He manages his own radiation exposure with the precision and attention of someone who has been doing it for decades and who knows exactly what happens when the management fails. His weekly treatments are essentially a sophisticated version of the same management that every Springfield resident would need if they had access to Burns's resources and Burns's understanding of what they are dealing with. The difference between Burns and the rest of Springfield's population is not the exposure, it is the management. Burns has the infrastructure to manage it. Springfield's residents do not, and most of them do not know they need it, because the management is the one thing Burns has not shared with the people his plant has been contaminating for decades. There is a moment in one episode where Burns is visited by an old friend from Yale, someone from outside Springfield, someone who has not been living inside the contamination zone, someone whose biology has not been subject to the decades of accumulated exposure that shapes the bodies and minds of everyone Burns employs. The contrast between this outside visitor and the Springfield residents who surround him is visible in the way the show draws them. The visitor looks like a different kind of being, not alien, not dramatically other, but simply less affected, less distorted. More like what a person looks like when they have not been living inside a zone that the federal government would eventually classify as requiring physical containment. Burns sees this contrast every time someone from outside comes to visit. He has always seen it. He has been seeing it for decades, watching the gap between his residents and the outside world grow incrementally with each generation born inside the zone. Each year of additional exposure, each failure to address each new violation, cataloged in safety inspections that he declines to respond to. He keeps hiring Homer. That is what matters. He always comes back and hires Homer again. Every time the circumstances of the plant's ownership change, every time someone else briefly takes the reins and installs a competent replacement, Burns returns and finds Homer and puts him back in the chair. It is the one personnel decision Burns makes with consistency across the entire run of the show. Whatever else changes, Homer stays. Expanded Section 2 Continuation. The Coma Theory. The evidence that keeps building. The God conversation in Homer the Heretic is the detail that the coma theory's advocates return to most often, and for good reason. Its placement in the timeline is exact, and its content is remarkably specific for a scene that the show frames as comedy rather than prophecy. Homer is in conversation with God, the actual divine presence, portrayed as a figure with whom Homer can have a direct and apparently two-way exchange. During this conversation, God makes a statement about Homer's future. The language the show uses is the language of anticipation, of something approaching. God tells Homer that he will one day understand things he does not currently understand, that his time is coming. The framing is temporal, not a general promise of eventual enlightenment, but a specific indication of a timeline. Homer's moment of understanding is coming. It is a near thing. he should be aware of its approach. 6 months pass in real time between that episode and the coma episode. Within the show's internal timeline, the distance is shorter. The floating timeline does not map perfectly onto the broadcast calendar, but the sequential relationship is clear. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer falls into a coma, from which the theory argues he never wakes. Interpret the God conversation under the coma theory, and what you get is not a quirky theological gag. You get a warning. God was not offering Homer philosophical consolation or religious promise. God was telling Homer that his conscious life was about to end. The meaning of life that Homer would eventually understand is not a conceptual insight. It is the experience of losing consciousness in a hospital room and spending the remainder of his existence in a dream that is sustained by the love he felt for his family in the moment before the vending machine fell. That is the meaning, that the family was everything, that the family was worth building an entire simulated universe to preserve. The celebrity flood argument for the coma theory is worth developing at greater length than it typically receives, because the mechanism it proposes is both elegant and specific. In the pre-coma seasons, celebrity guest appearances are rare and tend to be anchored to the story in ways that make narrative sense. They are not random intrusions of famous people into the Simpsons' ordinary life. They are stories about specific encounters between the family and specific figures, built around reasons those encounters might plausibly occur. After the coma, the structure changes. Celebrity appearances become enormously more frequent, and many of them have a quality of ambient association rather than narrative necessity. Famous people show up in Springfield not because the story required them to be there, but because they are present in the cultural atmosphere of the moment. Their appearance does not transform the story. It is the appearance itself that is the point. Under the coma theory, this change makes perfect sense. Homer is lying in a hospital room. The room has a television that is on. Visitors come and go and speak to each other and to Homer's still form about the world outside. The radio at the nursing station plays. News programs cycle through. Sounds filter through the fog of unconsciousness and fragments a name mentioned, a voice heard briefly, a reference absorbed without the context that would make it fully meaningful. Homer's dreaming brain takes these ambient fragments and incorporates them into the simulation. The famous person whose name filtered through the fog becomes a character in the dream, not a fully realized character built from actual knowledge of the person, but an approximation, a dream figure assembled from whatever fragments the comatose mind managed to absorb through the noise of the hospital world around it. The increasing frequency of celebrity appearances in later seasons is, in the coma reading, a symptom of a specific change in Homer's condition. As the brain deteriorates further, the dreaming mind's capacity for purely internal generation diminishes. It becomes more dependent on external stimuli to populate the simulation. The dream becomes less self-sustaining, more reliant on the ambient noise of the hospital world to provide it with content. The simulation draws more heavily on the outside world because the internal resources that sustained it in the early years are progressively failing. The celebrities flood in because the dream needs them, not for story reasons, for maintenance reasons. The reset button is the feature of the show that the coma theory explains most cleanly, and it is worth dwelling on because it is the feature that causes the most friction between the show's defenders and its critics. The argument that Springfield experiences world-altering catastrophes and returns to baseline by the next episode without anyone carrying the memory of what happened is frequently cited as the show's most significant structural failing, as evidence of writers who are either careless about continuity or indifferent to the consequences of the stories they are telling. The coma theory converts this failing into a feature. The reset is not carelessness. The reset is how a dreaming mind handles the end of a dream cycle. When we sleep, each dream episode is self-contained. We do not carry the emotional weight of a nightmare into the next dream. The dream environment clears, the simulation begins fresh, and the contents of the previous cycle are not carried forward unless something in the dreamer's psychology is specifically replaying them. Homer's coma dream resets because that is the behavior of a dreaming mind operating across cycles. Each episode is one dream. The episodes do not connect because dreams do not connect in the way that waking experiences connect. The world is rebuilt fresh each time because the dreaming mind rebuilds it fresh each time, not from scratch but from the fixed template that the beginning of the coma established. The family is always intact when the reset happens. Whatever has occurred during the episode, whatever disaster has struck, whatever catastrophe has played out, whatever consequences have accumulated is dissolved, and the family is restored to baseline. Not because the show needs them at baseline for production convenience. Because Homer's dreaming mind cannot sustain a version of the simulation in which his family is not intact. The dream's fundamental purpose is to preserve the family. Any dream cycle that ends with the family broken or diminished or absent would defeat the purpose of the dream. So the reset always restores them, always puts them back, always returns to the couch on Evergreen Terrace with everyone present. Because in the dream, in the only world that matters to the mind generating it, the family is always okay. Expanded Section 3 Continuation. The Burns shooting, the evidence that multiplies. The motive architecture that the show built across Part 1 of the shooting arc is worth examining in more detail than it usually receives, because the comprehensiveness of the motives it established was, in retrospect, either a remarkable piece of misdirection or genuine evidence that the answer was never meant to be as straightforward as the show eventually presented it. Burns's actions in the lead-up to the shooting were not a single transgression or a single act of corporate overreach. They were a systematic campaign of destruction that touched every significant social institution in Springfield simultaneously. The school lost its funding, the retirement home was destroyed, the local bar was bankrupt, a family pet was injured, and then the sun was blocked. The escalation follows a specific pattern, each act larger than the last, each one touching a different segment of the community's life, until the final act is not targeted at any specific person or institution, but at the community itself, at the basic environmental conditions of daily life. When you construct a villain's crime spree this way, when you give every single person in the community a documented, specific, personal motive simultaneously, you are doing one of two things narratively. Either you are building toward a resolution in which the community acts collectively, in which the villain is brought down by the accumulated weight of the people he has wronged acting in concert, or you are using the universality of the motive as cover as a way of making any individual suspect plausible while making the identification of the actual shooter genuinely difficult. The show went with the second approach. By making everyone a viable suspect, it ensured that identifying the specific individual responsible required something beyond motive. It required evidence that pointed to one person rather than any of the dozens of people who had equal reason to want Burns harmed. The DNA evidence, the eyelash found on Burns's clothing that matched a Simpson, is the most apparently concrete piece of physical evidence in the case, and it is the evidence that Homer's arrest hinges on. But the DNA evidence only proves that a Simpson was in physical contact with Burns in or around the time of the shooting. It does not prove which Simpson. It does not prove the contact occurred in the context of the shooting rather than some earlier encounter. It does not prove that the Simpson whose DNA it represents was the one who pulled the trigger rather than the one who helped Burns to his feet after he fell, or touched his clothing for any of the dozen innocent reasons that might produce an eyelash on another person's clothing. The eyelash points to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints are on the gun. These two pieces of evidence, combined with Homer's motive, produce a case against Homer that feels compelling. But consider, Homer's fingerprints would be on Burns's gun if Homer had picked the gun up from the ground, not to fire it, but simply because he found it lying there after the shooting and handled it before understanding what it was. The sequence of events that the show presents for Maggie would work equally well for Homer stumbling onto the scene after the fact and being the first person to find the gun. And consider what Burns's behavior after the shooting reveals about what he knew. Burns woke up, he looked around the hospital room. He identified his shooter. He said it was Maggie. He was clear and confident and immediate about it. But consider the alternative version of that moment. Burns woke up and looked around the hospital room and understood exactly what had happened and who had done it. He had time in the hospital, over the days of his recovery, to think about what identifying the real shooter would mean for the person who shot him, for their family, for whatever it is in Burns that, despite everything, can occasionally be moved by something other than self-interest. And Burns made a decision. He gave the police an answer that closed the case without damaging anyone the case had not already targeted. He gave them Maggie, because Maggie was the one answer that produced no further harm, that closed the loop, that allowed the investigation to end without a prosecution. The baby as shooter is the perfect answer, not because it is the most plausible answer, but because it is the most consequence-free answer. No trial, no conviction, no ongoing legal jeopardy for anyone. The case is closed, the victim has named the attacker cannot be charged, and Springfield moves on. Burns has given everyone exactly what they needed: resolution, without aftermath. Whether he did this to protect Marge, to protect Homer, to protect someone else entirely, or simply because he calculated that the aftermath of any other answer was more disruptive to his operations than the aftermath of this one, is something the show leaves open. The choice itself is documented. The reasoning behind it is not. And in Springfield, the gap between what happened and what the official record says happened is where the most interesting stories live. Expanded Section 4 Continuation: Burns's immortality, the system he built. The Three Stooges syndrome diagnosis deserves to be examined from a different angle than it is usually approached, because the comedy of the scene tends to obscure the specific medical reality the doctor is describing. The doctor is not saying that Burns has an interesting and unusual condition. The doctor is saying that Burns's body is hosting a complete catalog of human disease simultaneously, and that the diseases are in equilibrium. Every pathogen, every degenerative condition, every systemic failure mode available to human biology is present and active in Burns's body at the same time. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration for comic effect. Within the show's fiction, this is the literal clinical finding. Burns carries everything. The implication that the show does not draw, but that the contamination and immortality theories draw for it, is that this condition is not a natural one. Human bodies exposed to normal environments accumulate diseases in sequences and combinations that reflect their specific circumstances, their genetics, their exposures, their immune history. The accumulation follows patterns. Certain conditions predispose to others. Certain combinations are common, certain combinations are rare. A body that has somehow acquired every disease simultaneously is not following any natural pattern. It is following a pattern that would only emerge if the body had been exposed to an extraordinary diversity of damaging inputs over an extraordinary span of time. Burns has been alive for over a century. His body has been accumulating these inputs for over a century in the specific environment of a nuclear facility that leaks radiation into its own workers and management as readily as it leaks it into the surrounding community. A body with a century of exposure to radioactive materials, with a century of proximity to the specific chemical environment of a nuclear facility, with a century of accumulated biological insult from 100 different directions, that body would look like what the doctor describes. It would carry everything. It would be the sickest possible body. And if it had simultaneously been managed, treated, maintained with the resources and expertise that Burns's wealth provides, it would also be in equilibrium. The treatments do not cure the diseases. They manage the equilibrium that the diseases have found among themselves. They keep everything balanced. They are the control rods in the reactor that Burns's body has become. Burns's relationship with his own mortality is visible in the way he speaks about it in various episodes with a mixture of contempt and anxiety that suggests a man who has been managing his relationship with death for long. Enough that the management has become routine, but the underlying anxiety has never quite resolved. He does not fear death the way a person who has not been this close to it fears death. He manages it, he treats it as an operational problem with known solutions rather than an existential confrontation with the limits of existence. This is the relationship you develop with mortality when you have been living near it and working around it and paying professionals to keep it at a specific distance. For over 100 years, Smithers has been at the center of this management for as long as the show has depicted their relationship. The emotional complexity of Smithers's devotion to Burns has been the subject of sustained narrative attention across the show's run, the complicated feelings, the professional dedication that has grown into something more personal and more consuming. The way Smithers's entire identity has been organized around Burns's continued existence and comfort, but underneath the emotional complexity is the operational reality, which is simpler and in some ways more alarming. Smithers keeps Burns alive through logistics. He manages the schedule that keeps the treatments coming. He monitors the physical condition that the treatments are maintaining. He is the one person in Springfield who fully understands the system, and his understanding makes him not just a devoted assistant but a structural necessity, a necessary component of the machine that Burns built to ensure his own survival. What Smithers knows And what the show hints at without stating directly is that his departure would not merely inconvenience Burns, it would kill him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but within the week, as surely as if Smithers had pulled a plug. The treatment interval is weekly. Miss 1 and the equilibrium begins to shift. Miss 2 and the shift becomes pronounced. By the third week, every disease in that equilibrium surges simultaneously with nothing restraining any of them, and what the doctor called Three Stooges syndrome, the stalemate that keeps Burns functioning, despite carrying every illness, resolves in the worst possible direction. Smithers knows this and stays. He has always known it and always stayed. Whether from genuine devotion, from the weight of what he has built with Burns across decades, from the simple inability to abandon someone whose dependency on him is so total and so biological, the show does not resolve this question cleanly, because the answer is probably all three things at once, and the three things are inseparable from each other. What matters for the immortality theory is the simple operational fact. Smithers is the mechanism by which Burns continues to exist. Burns built the machine. Smithers runs the machine. And as long as the machine runs, Burns lives. Expanded Section 5 Continuation. Springfield's denial, the history of chosen forgetting. The specific precedents for Springfield's denial that the show has accumulated across its run form a pattern that the principal and the pauper makes explicit, but that was always present. The three-eyed fish is perhaps the earliest and cleanest example. Blinky is pulled from the river and becomes national news within the show's universe. The connection between Blinky's mutation and the nuclear plant upstream is not ambiguous. It is the central argument of the gubernatorial candidate who uses Blinky as evidence. The causal chain is drawn explicitly. The plant's runoff produces radioactive contamination in the river. The contamination affects the fish. The fish have developed an additional eye as a direct result. This is stated, publicly, on the show's version of television, in front of an audience that includes the entire Springfield community. And Springfield looks at this evidence and looks at Burns, and watches Burns eat the fish on television and moves on. Not because the evidence is insufficient, because the evidence leads somewhere the community cannot afford to go. If the fish are mutated, the water is contaminated. If the water is contaminated, the plant is responsible. If the plant is responsible, Burns is accountable. If Burns is accountable, the town's economic foundation, the plant's employment, the power supply, the entire infrastructure of the community's daily life is in jeopardy. Springfield does not ignore Blinky out of ignorance. Springfield ignores Blinky out of a very clear-eyed understanding of what acknowledging Blinky would cost. The collective decision to accept Burns's televised fish eating as sufficient reassurance is not stupidity. It is the rational behavior of a community that has performed the cost-benefit analysis of acknowledging the truth versus maintaining the comfortable fiction, found that the comfortable fiction is significantly less expensive, and decided accordingly. This is the same calculation that produces the Tamzarian vote. Springfield knows that Armin Tamzarian is not Seymour Skinner. They have been presented with the evidence. They have met the real person. The truth is not disputed. The vote is not about whether the truth is true. It is about whether acknowledging the truth is worth what acknowledgement would cost. The cost is disruption to the school, to the established relationship between the town and its principal, to 20 years of social tissue built around a person who was, for all practical purposes, exactly who he said he was, regardless of what his birth certificate read. The benefit is honesty. And in Springfield's calculus, honesty is consistently valued below stability. This is why the legal decree matters. Judge Snyder's ruling that the truth is inadmissible, that it is not just unwelcome but legally prohibited, is the community's ultimate expression of a preference it has held and acted on for decades. Springfield is not just choosing not to acknowledge inconvenient truths. It is formalizing the choice, institutionalizing it, giving the choice the weight of law so that the next time an inconvenient truth arrives, the community will not have to go through the discomfort of the vote. The machinery will already be in place. The truth will already be illegal. The exile will already be prepared. The real Seymour Skinner being tied to a railroad car is the most literal version of something the show does in almost every episode that involves a character insisting on an inconvenient truth in Springfield. The person is removed. Not always physically, sometimes the removal is social, through mockery or dismissal or the simple refusal of the community to engage with what the truth teller is saying. But the pattern is consistent. Truth arrives. Community assesses cost. Cost is found unacceptable. Truth is expelled. Community continues. Lisa is the character who experiences this pattern most consistently across the show's run. She identifies problems. She presents evidence. She makes arguments that are, by the show's own internal logic, correct. The plant is contaminating the water. Burns's policies are harmful. The school's priorities are wrong. The community's behavior is destructive. And the community's response, episode after episode, is the soft version of the Skinner treatment. Lisa is ignored. Lisa is dismissed. Lisa is told that she is making things difficult. The truth she is insisting on is not illegal in her case, but it is treated as a social violation, as the kind of behavior that marks you as someone the community cannot fully accommodate, someone whose correctness is less socially functional than someone else's comfortable wrongness. Springfield does not hate Lisa. Springfield loves Lisa the way communities love their truth tellers at a safe distance. In retrospect, after the damage has been done and the uncomfortable knowledge has become comfortable history, in the moment, while the truth is still dangerous, Springfield ignores her. The mechanisms of collective denial have been operating long enough that they apply automatically, without deliberation, to anyone who presents information the community would prefer not to have. Expanded Section 6 Continuation. Maggie's intelligence. What 36 years of observation produces. The specific nature of Maggie's intelligence, as documented across the show's run, follows a pattern that becomes more coherent when you view it across the full arc, rather than episode by episode. Maggie's capabilities are consistently demonstrated in contexts that share a specific structural quality. They all involve protecting something or someone from a threat that the other characters have either failed to recognize or failed to respond to effectively. She does not demonstrate her intelligence in abstract settings, not through tests or academic exercises or the kind of visible cognitive performance that would draw attention to itself and invite scrutiny. She demonstrates it through action, in real situations, in the moments when the action she takes is the decisive one, and the credit for the outcome is distributed to circumstance or luck, rather than to the agent who produced it. This is not coincidence. The situations where Maggie acts are the situations where action is most necessary and most protected from attention. Emergency contexts where the focus is on the crisis rather than on who resolved it, where the resolution is attributed to the nearest available explanation rather than to a baby who should not have been capable of producing it. When Maggie saves Homer from choking in one episode, the scenario plays as a touching comedic moment, the baby who accidentally succeeds at something she could not understand. But the specificity of what she does is not accidental. She identifies the problem, locates herself appropriately to address it, and executes a solution that works. The show plays it for sentiment. The execution beneath the sentiment is precise. When Maggie leads the daycare rebellion in The Longest Daycare, she is operating in a context that is, from the outside, entirely invisible. Nobody is watching the babies closely enough to see them being organized. The daycare staff monitors the babies the way adults monitor babies, with the assumption that babies are passive agents of their environment rather than active organizers of it. The assumption creates the blind spot that Maggie operates inside. She is invisible to the surveillance, because the surveillance is not looking for what she is doing. It is looking for what babies do: cry, fall down, put things in their mouths. Maggie is doing something else entirely. And the gap between what the staff expects and what Maggie is actually doing is the gap that allows the plan to succeed. This is the same gap she operates inside every time. The gap between what a baby is expected to do and what this baby is actually capable of doing. The gap is the resource, and Maggie has been cultivating it since birth. She maintains the gap through performed incapability, through the deliberate exhibition of the behaviors that confirm the expectations of the people around her. She falls down. She needs to be carried. She makes pacifier sounds. She appears to be exactly what everyone around her has decided she is, and inside that appearance she watches and plans and waits. The intelligence test results that appear in various episodes, the off-the-charts scores, the readings that exceed what the instruments can measure, are typically treated by the show as one-off gags. A quick reveal, a laugh, a return to the ongoing story. But the consistency of the pattern across multiple episodes means the show has been building something, even if no single episode frames it as construction. The off-the-chart score is funny once. The fourth off-the-chart score in a series is a documented fact about the character. Maggie's intelligence is extraordinary. This is established. The show has confirmed it repeatedly and has never retracted it. What the show has not done is follow the confirmation to its implications. The theory follows it for the show. If Maggie is genuinely operating at the cognitive level the testing suggests, and if she has been doing so since birth, then 36 years of observation from inside the Simpson family and inside Springfield have given her an analytical dataset that no other character in the show possesses. Homer's duration in Springfield is similar, but Homer cannot analyze what he observes effectively. Lisa has the analytical capability, but not the patience or the strategic discipline that silence produces. Lisa acts on what she observes, immediately and visibly, which produces results but also produces the friction and dismissal that has defined her experience. Maggie has both the capability and the patience and the cover of invisibility that the other two lack. She has been watching burns for 36 years. She has been watching the plant, watching the town's patterns of denial, watching the resets, watching the accumulated evidence of what the contamination has done and is doing and will continue to do. She has been watching Homer go to work every day for the man who destroyed his family, watching Marge hold the household together through the sheer force of her patience, watching Lisa fight and be worn down. She has been watching Springfield vote to forget, repeatedly, across decades, and she has said nothing, done nothing visible, revealed nothing of what she has been building behind the silence and the pacifier and the enormous eyes that the show has been drawing, with an attention to their expressive capacity that the show does not apply to the eyes of any other character with the same consistency. What Maggie is waiting for is the only question the show has declined to answer across 36 years of episodes that have answered almost everything else. The shooting gave us a glimpse of her capacity for decisive action. The daycare rebellion gave us a glimpse of her capacity for strategic planning across a complex and multivariable environment. Various other episodes have given us glimpses of her ability to perceive and respond to situations that the adults in her life cannot see at all. But the glimpses have always been contained, always resolved within the episode, never built toward anything cumulative. The theory says the cumulation is happening, quietly, below the radar of everyone watching and everyone in Springfield. The plan is building. The moment Maggie has been preparing for has not arrived yet, and the show has been running long enough that the preparation has had more time than any plan in the history of the fictional universe it is set in. Whatever Maggie decides to do when she finally breaks her silence, she will have had 36 years of uninterrupted observation to prepare for it. Expanded Section 7 Continuation. The predictions. The cases that resist easy explanation. The statistical framework for the prediction phenomenon volume, confirmation bias, and trend extrapolation handles the majority of the cases on the list comfortably and handles them correctly. But there is a subset of cases where the statistical argument requires more qualification than its advocates typically offer. The Siegfried and Roy case is one of these. The episode in question did not make a general observation about the dangers of performing with exotic animals. It depicted a specific scenario in which one of the famous performers was attacked by a white tiger during a performance, resulting in serious injury. The real event in 2003 involved Roy Horn being critically injured by a white tiger during a performance. The alignment is not general and thematic. It is specific. The animal species, the type of act, the performer's role, the result. The statistical argument can handle general trend alignments. If you make enough jokes about celebrity politics, one of them will eventually align with an actual election. It handles the specific detail cases with more difficulty. The Cypress Hill case is another. There is no trend that a careful observer of American culture in 1996 could have extrapolated to produce the specific outcome of Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall in 2024. This is not a logical destination of any cultural trajectory visible in 1996. It is a highly specific joke about a highly improbable pairing that became a highly specific real event after a 28-year interval. The statistics of volume do not explain this case elegantly. They explain it technically with enough content over enough years. Some very specific things will accidentally align with very specific future events, but the alignment between the level of specificity and the claimed mechanism is strained. This is where the cultural influence argument becomes most interesting. The Simpsons joke about Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra entered the cultural bloodstream in 1996. Millions of people saw it. Some of them were musicians, music industry professionals, event organizers, people with the means and platform to make unusual cultural collaborations happen. The joke established the combination as an idea that existed in the world, as a concept that had been articulated in a form that people had encountered and that therefore lived, in some attenuated form, in the cultural imagination. Whether the Cypress Hill LSO collaboration in 2024 was influenced by the 1996 joke, whether someone in the chain of decisions that produced it had the joke in mind, or the joke had been absorbed into the general cultural sense of what an interesting collaboration might look like, is not something that can be demonstrated. But the pathway from joke to reality, through cultural influence, is at least as plausible as coincidence for cases at this level of specificity. The Trump escalator sequence is worth revisiting in this context. The episode's depiction of Trump descending an escalator is specific enough that it has been reproduced side by side with footage from Trump's 2015 announcement dozens of times across the internet in a comparison that the show's defenders have struggled to dismiss as pure coincidence. The escalator descent is not a general political observation. It is a specific visual image that aligns with a specific real visual image to a degree that makes the phrase pure coincidence feel inadequate even when the statistical argument is otherwise available. The cultural influence argument handles this case. The episode's depiction entered the cultural landscape, was seen by millions of people, and became part of the shared vocabulary of how Trump's potential presidential ambitions were discussed and imagined. When Trump's campaign team designed his announcement, whether or not anyone involved had the Simpsons episode consciously in mind, the image of Trump descending an escalator existed as a cultural reference point that the announcement could be unconsciously drawing on or consciously echoing. The Simpsons did not predict the announcement. The announcement, in some sense that is not supernatural but is also not purely coincidental, reflects the cultural environment that The Simpsons had been contributing to for 16 years. This is the deepest reading of the prediction phenomenon, and it is more interesting than either the conspiracy version or the pure statistics version. The Simpsons has been operating on American culture for so long, at such volume, with such saturation, that the culture has partially become the show. The references, the images, the satirical framings of American institutions and personalities and events that the show has produced over 36 years have become part of the background against which Americans process their own country. The show has provided the imagination with so many possible versions of American future that when the future arrives, it is arriving into a cultural environment that has been partially shaped by the possible futures the show already depicted. Springfield does not predict America. America grew up inside Springfield. The mirror held up for 36 years eventually becomes the thing you see when you look at yourself. Expanded Section 8 continuation, Mona and Homer. The depth of the wound. The specific emotional damage that Homer carries from his mother's disappearance is worth tracing through the show's characterization of him in more detail than the conspiracy theory aspect of the theory typically requires, because the damage is not just the context for the conspiracy. The damage is the evidence for it. Homer's need for approval from people who treat him badly is one of the most consistent elements of his characterization across the entire run of the show. It is not played as a simple character flaw as the endearing incompetence of a lovable oaf. It is played in the moments when the show allows itself to take it seriously, as the specific dysfunction of a person who was taught at a very young age that the people who were supposed to stay do not stay, and that the best response to this lesson is to become the kind of person who makes it too inconvenient for anyone to leave. Homer endures humiliation from Burns on a scale that should have produced either confrontation or resignation years ago. Burns does not remember his name after years of employment. Burns demeans him in public, assigns him to the most dangerous and least rewarding work, pays him wages that the show has depicted as insufficient for his family's basic comfort, and has demonstrated across multiple episodes a casual indifference to Homer's welfare that borders on contempt. And Homer stays. Not because he has no options, the show has occasionally depicted Homer in other employment, briefly, before circumstances return him to the plant. Homer stays because staying is what he knows how to do in a relationship with someone who has the power to make him feel either wanted or invisible. This is the pattern of a person shaped by early abandonment. The tolerance for treatment that does not meet the minimum standard of respect reflects the internal calculation of someone whose baseline for acceptable treatment was set during a formative period in which the most important person in their life left without warning or explanation. When the most significant abandonment of your childhood is unexplained, when your mother vanishes overnight and you are told she is dead and you grow up believing the loss was final and incomprehensible, the lesson you learn is not that people who treat you badly should be held accountable. The lesson is that people leave, that the thing you did to cause it might be something you cannot identify or correct, and that the best strategy is to make yourself useful enough and easy enough and undemanding enough that the leaving does not happen again. Homer's psychology in this reading is not the psychology of a man who is too stupid to recognize that he is being mistreated. It is the psychology of a man who learned at 6 years old that good treatment is fragile and unavoidable loss is the default. Everything Burns does to Homer fits comfortably within the range of behavior that Homer's psychology has been trained to accept as the cost of remaining employed, remaining present, remaining connected to the community around him rather than being alone. Burns engineered this, not through a single deliberate act of psychological manipulation, but through the prior act of driving Mona away at the moment in Homer's development when her presence was most formative. The engineering was done once, in 1969, and its product has been running itself ever since. Burns did not need to do anything to Homer directly. He just needed Homer to grow up with a specific wound in a specific place, and the wound would do the rest. The deal with Grandpa is the confirmation that the engineering was deliberate rather than incidental. Burns guaranteed Homer's employment not as an act of generosity or indifference, but as a calculated move to ensure that the specific person he needed in that chair, a person with Homer's exact psychological profile, a person too damaged to challenge anything and too afraid of abandonment to leave, would stay there indefinitely. The guarantee removed the only leverage Homer might otherwise have had, the ability to quit. With the guarantee in place, quitting became meaningless. Homer's employment was secure regardless of what he did, which also meant that the employment provided Homer with no incentive to perform, no reason to improve, no mechanism by which the process of holding the job might build the kind of competence and confidence that would eventually make Homer capable of seeing the situation for what it was. Homer is protected from growth by the structure of his employment. The guarantee ensures he cannot be fired, which means the feedback mechanisms that might otherwise push a person toward greater capability are absent. Homer remains in his cognitive and emotional state indefinitely, not because he could not change, but because the system he is embedded in has been designed to prevent change. Burns needed Homer compliant. The guarantee keeps him compliant. The wound inflicted in 1969 keeps him compliant. The radiation keeps him cognitively impaired. The crayon keeps him cognitively impaired. The entire architecture of Homer's life as a Springfield resident is an architecture of maintained incapacity. And Homer goes to work every day and does not know any of this. He cannot know it because the tools that would allow him to know it are the ones that have been most thoroughly removed. The intelligence that would recognize the pattern. The emotional stability that would allow him to investigate the wound rather than live around it. The social context that would tell him the story of what was done to his family and by whom and why. All of it removed, maintained in its removed state, by a system that was built specifically to keep it removed. He is not a fool. He is a man who was deliberately prevented from becoming something other than what the most powerful person in his community needed him to be. There is a difference. The show knows the difference. The tragedy of Homer Simpson is not the tragedy of a man too stupid to see his own situation. It is the tragedy of a man who was smart enough to be worth breaking. Expanded Section 9 Continuation. Springfield's location. The legal and existential stakes of ambiguity. The question of Springfield's location has attracted sustained fan attention because the unresolved mystery is genuinely frustrating. People want answers. The show offers clues and then withdraws them, offers confirmations and then contradicts them, offers the creator's own statement and then continues to act as though the statement was not made. The frustration is real, and the pattern that produces it is real. But the pattern has a logic that becomes visible when you stop treating the location question as a production oversight and start treating it as a design decision with specific purposes. A confirmed location for Springfield would change the show's relationship to accountability in significant ways, and not all of those ways are fictional. If Springfield were definitively placed in Oregon, then the state of Oregon's real environmental regulations would apply to discussions of the plant's operations. Environmental journalists could point to specific regulatory frameworks and ask specific questions about whether the fictional plant's documented violations would constitute crimes under Oregon law. The fictional contamination would have a real legal context. The fictional regulatory failure would have a real regulatory structure to measure it against. By remaining unlocated, Springfield's contamination zone exists in a kind of legal limbo within the show's fiction, which is useful for the show's thematic purposes in ways that a specific location would not be. The contamination can be as extreme as the story requires, without ever bumping against the specific real-world consequences that a located contamination zone would face. The plant can have 342 violations without any specific state's attorney general being positioned to investigate. Burns can operate with the impunity he operates with because there is no fixed jurisdiction within which his impunity can be challenged. This is not a commentary on Oregon's regulatory environment. It is an observation about how ambiguity functions as protection within the show's internal logic, how the absence of a fixed location produces a kind of regulatory immunity that a fixed location would immediately dissolve. There is a parallel to the way Burns himself operates. Burns's personal longevity makes him immune to the ordinary mechanisms of corporate accountability. Those mechanisms operate on timescales that assume normal human lifespans, and Burns has outlived every regulatory structure that has ever had jurisdiction over him. Springfield's geographic ambiguity provides the same immunity in a different register. The regulatory structures that would have jurisdiction over the plant cannot operate effectively without a fixed location, and the fixed location is the one thing the show refuses to provide. Together, the immortal owner and the unlocatable facility, they form a pair of immunities that are almost perfectly complementary. The owner cannot be brought to account in his lifetime because he has no lifetime in the ordinary sense. The facility cannot be brought to account through regulatory process because no regulatory process has unambiguous jurisdiction. Burns lives too long. Springfield exists nowhere. The combination is more protective than either alone, and the show has maintained both conditions with equal consistency across its entire run. The specific pieces of geographic evidence that the show has deployed over the years, the area codes, the state abbreviations, the climate details, the geographic features visible in various episodes function as a kind of ongoing tease that operates the same way as Burns's weekly treatments. They sustain the mystery. They give the audience enough to keep engaging with the question without ever giving enough to resolve it. The mystery stays alive because the evidence keeps being provided at exactly the rate that keeps people looking without ever providing the confirmatory detail that would allow them to stop. Matt Groening's Oregon Confession in 2012 was the closest the show ever came to resolving the question. And the show's subsequent behavior, the continued contradictions, the continued geographic impossibilities, the refusal to honor Groening's statement in the episodes that followed, suggests that the confirmation was either not binding on the writers or was itself a deliberate misdirection, another piece of evidence deployed at the calculated rate that sustains the mystery rather than resolving it. Springfield will not be located because Springfield is more valuable as an unlocated thing. It belongs to everyone precisely because it belongs nowhere specifically. And it is protected from accountability by precisely the same ambiguity that makes it universally recognizable. Expanded Section 10 Continuation. The floating timeline. What we voted for. The act of watching is not passive. This is something the show has understood about its audience for a long time, and the floating timeline is the place where that understanding is most clearly expressed. When we watch The Simpsons, we are making a choice. The choice is not dramatic or self-aware. It feels like nothing more than sitting down and turning on the television. But the show has been running for 36 years on the basis of exactly this choice being made, repeatedly, by millions of people who have never collectively articulated the terms of the agreement they have been participating in. The agreement is implicit. It has always been implicit, and what it says is this: we will accept the fiction that the family has not changed. We will watch Bart be 10 and Lisa be 8 and Homer stumble home from the plant and Marge hold the household together, and we will not ask when this stops. We will not demand an ending. We will not push for the growth that would force the show into the territory where a family sitcom becomes something else. An elegy, a farewell, the acknowledgement that things end. The agreement has produced one of the longest-running pieces of fiction in American cultural history. It has kept a family on television for longer than most of the people who watch them have been alive. It has made Springfield more permanent a fixture in American cultural life than most real towns, more consistently referenced than most real public figures, more emotionally resonant to most of its audience than most of the actual events they have lived through. This is what the floating timeline is in service of. Not production convenience, not creative laziness, not a failure of imagination. It is in service of the agreement. The agreement that says the family stays. The agreement that says we do not have to watch them grow old. The agreement that says whatever is happening in the real world, whatever is changing and ending and being lost, there is a house on Evergreen Terrace where nothing has changed since 1989, and we can go there whenever we need to. The show knew what it was doing when it refused to let the characters age. It knew, from very early in its run, that the permanence of the family was the product it was actually selling. The comedy was the vehicle. The adventures were the variety. The satire was the intelligence that made the show worth taking seriously. But the thing that kept people coming back, the thing that has produced 36 years of consistent audience, is the permanence. The family that never changes in a world that changes constantly. This is why the flash-forward episodes are so powerful and so carefully contained. Lisa's wedding in season 6 shows you a version of the future that is emotionally rich and carefully imagined and deeply moving. A 23-year-old Lisa who has become exactly who you hoped she would become, living a life that contains both her gifts and her struggles, engaged to someone who sees her clearly. The episode earns its emotion. And then the episode ends and Lisa is 8 again, and the future is sealed, and Springfield is reset. The seal matters as much as the glimpse. The show shows you the future to prove it has imagined it, to demonstrate that the writers know who these people would become if the clock were allowed to run. And then it seals the future away immediately, as though showing it for too long would make the seal impossible. The glimpse is carefully sized, large enough to move the audience, small enough that it does not break the agreement, large enough that you know the show could tell the story of these people aging, small enough that you know it will not. The audience has collaborated in this. Every week of watching is a renewal of the agreement. Every laugh at the couch gag, every recognition of a recurring joke, every moment of emotional connection with a family that has not aged in 3.5 decades, all of it is the agreement being renewed. We are not watching Springfield despite the frozen timeline. We are watching it because of the frozen timeline. The permanence is the point. And here is what makes the floating timeline the deepest theory in this collection. It is the only one that implicates the audience directly. The radiation theory is about what Burns did to Springfield. The coma theory is about what happened to Homer. The shooting theory is about what the show is hiding. The immortality theory is about what wealth enables. The denial theory is about what communities choose. The predictions theory is about what the show reveals. The Mona theory is about what was taken from one family. The location theory is about what ambiguity protects. The floating timeline is about us. We built the loop. We maintain the loop. Every time we watch, the loop tightens slightly more. Every season we ask for. Every renewal we celebrate. Every year we continue choosing the show over the alternative of watching it end. We are participating in the same collective action that Springfield took when it voted to keep the lie. We are voting for the fiction. We are choosing the comfortable permanence over the uncomfortable truth that 36 years have passed, and the children who should be growing up are still exactly the same age they were when we met them. We pressed pause in 1989. We have never pressed play. We have been holding the button down for 36 years with the full weight of our attention and our affection and our willingness to keep showing up, keep tuning in, keep renewing the agreement that says the family stays young, and Springfield will be there next week, and the week after, and the year after. The cooling towers will hum, the couch gag will play, Homer will come through the door at 5:30, Marge will be in the kitchen, Bart will be 10, Lisa will be 8. Maggie will be watching from her high chair with those enormous eyes that see everything and say nothing. The loop will run. Because we will not let it stop. Because letting it stop means admitting that it was always temporary. That the family we fell in love with in 1989 was always going to age away from us eventually. And the years we spent pretending otherwise were years the show let us have. Not because the pretense was true, but because the pretense was what we needed. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we froze them. Not the radiation, not the coma, not the collective denial of a cartoon town. Us. We are the theory that explains everything. And we have been watching the show for long enough to know it. That is the end of the journey. 2 hours in Springfield. We examined the plant and what it has done to the people living around it. We sat with Homer in his hospital bed and considered whether the man behind the eyelids has been sleeping for 30 years. We reopened the shooting case and found, in the forensic debris, more questions than the official verdict ever addressed. We traced Burns's survival back through a century of careful infrastructure. We watched a town vote to make truth illegal and expel the man who insisted on speaking it. We looked into Maggie's silence and found something building there. We counted the predictions and understood the trick. We followed Mona underground and traced the damage her disappearance left. We searched the map for Springfield and found it everywhere and nowhere. And we stared at the floating timeline until we recognized our own reflection in the loop. Every theory is different. Everyone arrives through different evidence and different logic. But they all end at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and deep and running through the entire show since the first episode. And the show has been showing you what it is for 36 years. In the background of the jokes. In the details you glanced at and moved past. In the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the cracked cooling towers. And the baby who watches everything. It has always been there. It is still there. It will be there next week. Exactly as we left it. Because in Springfield, the things that the town agrees to keep alive, stay alive. And we have been agreeing for 36 years to keep it all alive. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. Additional section Hans Moleman and Ned Flanders. The Quieter Darknesses. Not all of Springfield's mysteries announce themselves. Some of them sit in the margins of the show, appearing and reappearing across 3 decades of episodes, so quietly and consistently that the audience absorbs them as background texture rather than evidence. They are present in every season. They accumulate across hundreds of episodes. And when you finally turn and look at them directly, with the full weight of everything we have already established about Springfield, the contamination, the coma, the denial, the immortality, the strategic silence they take on a quality that the show's surface treatment of them as running gags does not account for. Hans Moleman is the first of these. If you have watched The Simpsons for any sustained period, you know Hans Moleman by sight, even if you do not know him by name. He is the tiny, elderly, nearly blind man who appears throughout Springfield's background scenes and exists within his function in the show's narrative economy. Primarily to suffer, he is struck by vehicles. He is crushed by falling objects. He is buried alive. He is consumed by animals. He is struck by lightning. He is caught in fires. He disappears under wheels and into sinkholes and off ledges. He falls, is fallen upon, is used as an unintentional projectile, and is subjected to an inventory of physical misfortunes that represents, by conservative estimate, the most comprehensive catalog of violence against a single character in the history of American animation. He dies. Repeatedly. Not in the Treehouse of Horror specials, where death is established as non-canonical, as the special Halloween episodes license to ignore continuity. Not in dream sequences or fantasy segments marked by the show's visual conventions as operating outside normal reality. In regular episodes, in the main body of the show's canonical continuity, Hans Moleman dies. His body ceases to function. The incident that caused the cessation is depicted, the cessation is depicted, and then the next regular episode places Moleman back in Springfield, unaltered, ready to be subjected to whatever the next incident will be. This is treated as a running gag. The audience laughs. Moleman dies again. Nobody addresses it, but under the contamination theory, Moleman's repeated deaths are something genuinely strange in a specific way that is worth following past the comfortable explanation of cartoon convention. If the radiation from the nuclear plant has altered the biology of Springfield's residents to produce the mutations we have documented, the physical invulnerability Homer exhibits, the cognitive supercharge of Maggie's intelligence, the disease equilibrium that sustains Burns then Moleman, may represent the most radical biological alteration in the town's population. Not the most prominent case, not the one with the most visible social consequences, but the most extreme in terms of what it has done to his relationship with mortality itself. Homer survives injuries that should be fatal. But Homer's invulnerability is passive. He endures damage and recovers from it without the survival requiring any active biological mechanism beyond extraordinary resilience. He does not die and come back. He simply does not fully die. Moleman's situation appears to be different. Moleman actually dies. His body ceases function in ways that are depicted as complete and final within individual scenes, and then reappears in the following episode as though the cessation did not occur. If the contamination theory is correct, Moleman represents the outer extreme of what the plant's runoff does to cellular biology when the exposure is sufficient and the individual's biological response to it is particular. His cellular structure has been so comprehensively altered by radiation that death itself has become a temporary condition for him. The mechanisms that normally produce irreversible cellular failure, the cascades that make death permanent in unaltered biology, have been disrupted or redirected by the contamination in ways that allow his body to reconstitute itself after events that should be final. This is an extreme reading, but the show supports it with one specific and often overlooked detail. Moleman has stated his age as 31 years old. 31. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s by every visual indicator the show provides. His posture is that of extreme age. His skin has the quality of someone who has been alive for many decades beyond 31. His eyesight is so poor that he requires thick glasses to navigate a world that has apparently been defeating him at this task for his entire apparent lifetime. If he is telling the truth, and the show provides no in-universe reason to assume he is lying, then something aged him catastrophically and rapidly. Something took a man in his early 30s and compressed decades of biological deterioration into a period of his life when biological deterioration should not have been occurring at anything like that rate. The contamination theory has an answer for this. The same exposure that altered Moleman's relationship with mortality also dramatically accelerated his aging process. The radiation did to his cellular aging mechanisms what it did to every other biological system in his body. It altered them in ways that produced outcomes no normal biology would produce, driving his visible aging forward at a rate disconnected from his chronological age, while simultaneously giving his body the capacity to survive and reconstitute after events that should be permanently destructive. He is 31 years old. He has died dozens of times. He appears to be 90. He keeps coming back. Under the coma theory, Moleman functions differently as a background process in Homer's dreaming mind, a minor character that the dream assembles and places in scenes to give Springfield its necessary density of population, but does not invest with the continuity that the dream reserves for the people Homer actually cares about. Moleman dies because Homer's dreaming mind occasionally lets minor characters lapse, and he returns because the next scene requires his presence, and the dreaming mind reconstructs him without difficulty or consequence, the way a dream populates its own background automatically without the dreamer having to make any deliberate choice about it. The collective denial theory offers the reading that is perhaps the most resonant for what it reveals about Springfield as a community. A man dies in public. He dies in front of witnesses, in scenes where other Springfield residents are present. Nobody calls for emergency services. Nobody files a report. Nobody asks why the same elderly man keeps appearing to die and then reappearing in subsequent scenes as though the dying did not occur. The town has normalized Moleman's death cycle, the way it has normalized everything else that should generate alarm. The three-eyed fish, the billionaire who glows in the dark, the principal who turned out to be someone else, a tiny old man who dies and comes back in an ongoing cycle that no one in Springfield has ever thought to investigate. Moleman's repeated deaths are just another thing Springfield has voted not to notice. Another piece of evidence filed under the long list of things that the community's social contract has declared irrelevant. The man dies, the town moves on. The episode continues. Springfield forgets, because forgetting is what Springfield does best, and Mulman dying is just one more thing that would become inconvenient if anyone decided to remember it. Now consider Ned Flanders, because Ned is the character through whom the show makes its most sustained and most pointed argument about the relationship between moral behavior and reward in Springfield's universe. On the surface, and the show maintains this surface with impressive commitment across the entire run, Ned is the best man in Springfield. He is kind with a consistency that the show has never once depicted as strategic or performed. He is generous in ways that cost him something real: time, money, effort, the social friction of extending grace to people who have not earned it and will not acknowledge it. He is devout in a way that has shaped every aspect of his daily life, not as performance but as the actual architecture of how he moves through the world. He is a good father. He is a good neighbor. He is a good man in the full, unglamorous, daily practice sense of the word, not a man who performs goodness for an audience, but a man who enacts it in the small spaces where no one is watching. And the show punishes him for it with a relentlessness that becomes, if you watch the full arc of his character across 36 seasons, genuinely uncomfortable to observe. Maude was killed at the Springfield Speedway by a misfiring t-shirt cannon in an incident whose causation the show links directly to Homer's reflexive self-preservation. Homer dodged the t-shirts. The cannon's trajectory was altered. The t-shirts hit Maude instead. Homer's selfishness killed Ned's wife. The show is not ambiguous about this chain of events. It depicts it clearly. And Ned's response was to forgive Homer, because Ned always forgives Homer, because that is the only response Ned's psychology has available to it. When a hurricane destroyed Ned's house, the most carefully maintained house on the street, the home of the most responsible and conscientious resident of the neighborhood, the community rallied to rebuild it. Their effort was genuine and well-intentioned, and structurally so incompetent that the replacement house collapsed almost immediately. The house of the man who does everything right is rebuilt by people who do things wrong, and it falls down, and Ned snaps. The snap is one of the most revealing moments in the show's characterization of Ned, and it is also one of the most revealing moments in the show's characterization of itself. Because when Ned breaks, when the psychological architecture of relentless forgiveness and patient grace finally fails under the weight of accumulated injustice, what comes out is not primarily anger, it is despair. The despair of a man who has been performing the requirements of goodness for his entire life and has received in return the systematic destruction of everything he was performing goodness to protect. The psychiatrist who treats Ned in the aftermath of the collapse reveals the source of his relentless positivity, and it is not spiritual. Ned was a violent and uncontrollable child. His parents, beatniks who rejected conventional discipline as a matter of philosophical principle, responded to their son's behavior by taking him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through an intensive behavioral modification process. The rage that lived inside young Ned was systematically suppressed. Not resolved, not processed, not channeled into healthy expression, suppressed. The conditioning built a cage around the original personality and installed the cheerful, patient, forgiving Ned in the cage's place. Ned's kindness is not a character trait that emerged from his life's experience and choices. It is a psychological structure imposed on him before he was old enough to have agency over his own development. His forgiveness of Homer is not grace. It is the programmed response of a nervous system that was conditioned, in childhood, to suppress anger at all costs and express the programmed alternative patience, forgiveness, cheerful goodwill regardless of what the circumstances would justify. He cannot be angry. The conditioning will not allow it. The forgiveness that the show presents as one of Ned's most admirable qualities is the most constrained thing about him. The expression of a system that removed his ability to feel and act on anger, not because anger is wrong, but because his parents found it inconvenient. This reframes every instance of Ned's famous forgiveness. Every time he forgives Homer for a fresh indignity, every time he extends grace to someone who has not earned it, every time he turns the other cheek, he is not demonstrating extraordinary virtue. He is demonstrating the limits of what his conditioning allows him to do. He cannot not forgive. The option was removed from his emotional repertoire decades ago. His virtue is involuntary, which does not make it less real in its effects, but does make it something other than what the show's surface reading presents it as. And then there is the God question. The show, in its own canonical fiction, has established that God is real and accessible. Homer has spoken with God directly, face to face, in multiple episodes. God acknowledges Homer, engages with him, tells him things about his life and his future, treats him as a person whose relationship with the divine is direct and personal. Homer, who sleeps during church services, who has broken most of the commandments that apply to him, who has never demonstrated the kind of sustained religious engagement that would seem to warrant a personal relationship with a divine presence, gets FaceTime with God. Ned Flanders, who attends services every week without exception, who reads scripture, who prays with genuine sincerity, who has organized his entire life around the expectations and requirements of his faith, who is by any reasonable assessment the most devout Christian in Springfield, has never, across 36 seasons, been depicted as receiving direct divine acknowledgement of any kind. God talks to Homer. God does not talk to Ned. The show makes this contrast quietly and never draws attention to it, but it is there, consistent across the entire run. The man who is performing his faith with the greatest visible commitment is the one the divine presence does not address. The man who maintains the loosest possible relationship with the requirements of that faith is the one who gets the conversations. This is not random cruelty on the show's part. It is a thesis statement about Springfield's universe. In Springfield, the rewards do not go to the most deserving. They go to whoever the system has decided to favor, and the system's decisions are governed by factors that have nothing to do with moral merit. Homer is favored by the system by Burns's need for his continued presence, by the coma dream's need for its protagonist to survive, by the contamination's particular effects on his specific biology, and his favor extends to the divine level. Homer gets God's attention because Homer is the show's center, and the show's universe orients itself around its center, regardless of who deserves the orientation. Ned is not the show's center. Ned is the show's argument. He is what the show produces when it wants to demonstrate that good behavior is not the mechanism by which Springfield rewards its residents. He is the counterexample, the evidence for the proposition that the system running Springfield does not respond to virtue. It responds to compliance, to usefulness, to the specific qualities that make someone valuable to the people and processes that hold power. Homer is useful to Burns. Homer is useful to the coma dream. Homer is protected by those utilities. Ned is not useful to any of the systems that generate outcomes in Springfield. He is merely good, and in Springfield, goodness without utility is not a claim on anything. The show has not been cruel to Ned. The show has been honest about Ned. It has shown, across 3 decades of consistent characterization, what happens to a man who does everything right in a system that was not designed to reward rightness. He loses his wife. His house falls down. He forgives because he has no other option, and the forgiveness goes unacknowledged. He prays because prayer is the architecture of his life, and the divine presence he is praying toward is busy having conversations with his neighbor. Ned Flanders is the saddest character in The Simpsons. Not Homer, who is protected from the full weight of his sadness by cognitive impairment. Not Lisa, who is young enough to still believe the weight will lighten. Not Burns, who is too powerful to feel sad about anything except the 1 or 2 things his century of living has revealed as genuinely beyond the reach of money. Ned, the man who does everything right, whose kindness is a cage, whose faith is answered with silence, whose wife was killed by his neighbor's selfishness, and who responded with forgiveness because the alternative was not available to him, whose house fell down and whose community built it wrong and who had to be institutionalized for breaking when it fell. Homer and Ned have been living next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, between the man who does everything wrong and faces no permanent consequences, and the man who does everything right and faces permanent loss, has never narrowed. It will never narrow. Because the gap is not the result of different choices or different circumstances or different luck. The gap is the architecture. The show built the gap deliberately and has maintained it with precision across its entire run, because the gap is what the show is about when it is being honest about itself, about what Springfield rewards, about who the system was built for, about the distance in a world built on contamination and denial and managed impunity between what people deserve and what they get. Final thoughts, the shape of everything. We have covered a lot of ground. The nuclear contamination theory showed us that the plant is not background, it is the engine. Every mutation, every unexplained resilience, every strange biological feature of Springfield's population, all of it traceable to the same source, maintained by the same negligence, overseen by the same incompetent safety inspector whose incompetence is not accidental. Homer's coma theory showed us that the entire show, after April 1993, may be the dream of a man who has been unconscious for 3 decades. That nobody ages because they exist in a frozen moment in an unconscious man's mind. That every escalating absurdity is a symptom of neurological deterioration. That the emotional core of everything, all the adventures, all the disasters, all the celebrity encounters and impossible recoveries, is a father who loved his family enough to build an entire world to keep living inside that love. The Burns shooting theory showed us that the official answer to the show's most famous mystery has documented gaps in it. That the evidence Burns himself described as coincidental is the evidence the show rests its resolution on. That alternate shooters were animated to completion and then dismissed. That Homer confessed to the shooting in season 18 in a line nobody investigated. That Maggie's final gesture can be read as memory as easily as confession. The Burns immortality theory showed us that the wealthiest man in Springfield stays alive through weekly radiation treatments that keep his comprehensive catalog of diseases in artificial equilibrium, managed by the only person who fully understands the system that keeps him running, too expensive to die, and too structurally necessary to be allowed to. The principle and the pauper theory showed us the mechanism behind every Springfield reset. The town does not forget passively. It votes to forget. It issues legal decrees. It ties the truth to a railroad car and expels it from the community. Every catastrophe that the show absorbs without permanent consequence is absorbed through the same mechanism, operating invisibly between episodes, enforcing the agreement that the agreed-upon version of events is what happened and anything else is inadmissible. Maggie's silence theory showed us that the most capable member of the Simpson family has been watching everything for 36 years from behind the most effective disguise available, looking like exactly what everyone expects a baby to look like: passive, dependent, unaware, and building something in the silence that the show has never revealed, and that 36 years of observation has given her more material to build with than any character in Springfield's history. The predictions theory showed us that the show does not predict the future. It shapes it through the mechanism of cultural saturation, through the way 36 years of observations about American life become part of the cultural lens through which Americans process their own experience. Springfield does not reflect America. America has been slowly becoming Springfield, one episode at a time, for 36 years. The Mona theory showed us that the emotional damage at the center of Homer's characterization is not natural. It was engineered by a single phone call Burns made in 1969, setting in motion a chain of events that separated a mother from her son for 27 years and produced, in the son, exactly the psychological profile that Burns needed in the safety inspector's chair: 3 generations of one family, broken by one man's grudge, and the man at the center of the damage going to work for the man who caused it every day for decades without understanding the connection. The location theory showed us that Springfield's unlocatability is not a production quirk. It is a structural feature of a contamination zone that has, in its deliberate absence from every map, achieved something that no amount of political maneuvering or regulatory corruption could have produced: complete immunity from the jurisdictional accountability that a fixed location would enable, and the floating timeline theory showed us what we already knew but had not articulated: that we built the loop. That the Simpsons are frozen in time because we needed them to be, because the alternative to their permanence is something we have been deferring for 36 years, and because every week we choose to watch is a vote cast in the same direction as every vote Springfield has cast to maintain its comfortable fictions. Every theory arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and deep and present in the show's DNA since the first episode. And the show has been showing it to us the whole time. In the background of the jokes, in the details we glanced past, in the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the cracked cooling towers and the baby with the enormous eyes, we became Springfield. The town we accepted as a cartoon backdrop is the most accurate portrait of American life produced by American culture in the last 36 years. The corrupt billionaire running the essential infrastructure, the incompetent government, the collective denial, the ordinary family trying to hold together inside a system that was never designed with their welfare as a priority. We watched it. We laughed. We tuned in next week. We pressed pause in 1989 and held the button down for 36 years, sustaining a family that cannot age, and a town that cannot be found, and a dream that cannot end, because the man having the dream will not stop having it, or maybe will not be allowed to stop, because we will not let him. Because as long as Homer is dreaming, the family is intact, and as long as the family is intact, we can go home to Evergreen Terrace whenever we need to. We can sit on the couch and let the couch gag play and know, for 22 minutes, that the family is together and the kids are young, and the house is the same and nothing has ended. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Bart is 10 years old. He will always be 10 years old. Springfield will always be wherever it needs to be. The plant will always be humming. Burns will always be alive. Maggie will always be watching. And Homer will always find his way home by the end of the episode. Because in his dream, in our dream, he never left. Additional material. The deeper mechanics of Springfield's world. There are threads running through the fabric of the show that the major theories do not always pause to address directly, threads that are worth pulling on, because they illuminate something about the logic the show is operating with, underneath its comedy surface. One of these is the specific nature of Homer's relationship to consequence. Homer experiences consequences in the short term. He gets injured, he loses jobs briefly, he faces the immediate results of his own decisions with a consistency that the show has maintained across its entire run, because the comedy of Homer's life depends on things going wrong for him in ways that are immediate and visible. What Homer does not experience are lasting consequences. The things that go wrong for him in one episode do not permanently alter his situation by the beginning of the next. The job he loses returns. The injury heals. The relationship strain resolves. The status quo reasserts itself with a regularity so precise that it looks less like the resilience of an optimistic man and more like the operation of a system that specifically needs him to remain at a fixed point. This is one of the contamination theory's subtler arguments. Burns needs Homer in the chair in Sector 7G. Not just any incompetent safety inspector Homer specifically. This person, with this psychology and this cognitive profile, and this specific inability to challenge authority or connect the dots between his own situation and the broader structures that produced it. The system that Burns has built around the plant's continued operation requires Homer to remain available for that chair. The deal with Grandpa ensures it legally. The psychological damage inflicted through Mona's disappearance ensures it emotionally. The radiation's effect on Homer's cognition ensures it intellectually. But the reset between episodes, the way Homer's situation always returns to baseline, also serves this function. If Homer's mistakes ever accumulated to a point where they permanently destabilized his position at the plant, the specific instrument Burns needs would be damaged beyond use. The reset is, in part, the system's maintenance of its most important tool. The coma reading offers a parallel and complementary explanation. Homer cannot accumulate permanent consequences in his dream, because a dreaming mind that is trying to sustain a simulation of normal life cannot afford to let the simulation degrade into something unrecognizable. If Homer's dream version of Springfield became permanently altered by the consequences of previous episodes, if the marriage deteriorated beyond recovery, if the children aged and left, if the job ended and the economic stability of the household dissolved, the dream would no longer be doing what the dreaming mind needs it to do. The dream exists to give Homer his family. Permanent consequences that threaten the family are dissolved by the reset because the dream's purpose overrides its realism. The reset is not a narrative convenience. It is a survival mechanism. These two explanations, from different theoretical frameworks, produce the same observation. Homer's consequence immunity is load-bearing. It is not incidental to the show's structure. It is the feature that allows every other story to be told. And both the contamination theory and the coma theory point to it as the mechanism most revealing of their underlying logic. There is also the question of what Springfield's children know. The show has always been careful to distinguish between what adults in Springfield do not know because they cannot know it, because their cognition has been damaged by the contamination, because Burns has kept the information from them, because the community's social contract has declared it off-limits, and what the children of Springfield do not know because they are children. But this distinction sits interestingly when applied to Bart. Bart is presented consistently as rebellious, defiant, instinctively opposed to authority in ways that get him into trouble with the institutional systems he is embedded in. He is not stupid. The show has established clearly that Bart's academic failures are the result of disengagement rather than incapacity. He can learn things when they interest him. He is creative, adaptable, and street smart in ways that his classroom performance does not reflect. His relationship with authority is not the passive indifference of someone who has not thought about the relationship. It is active resistance. Under the contamination theory, Bart's resistance is interesting in a specific way. He is the Simpson child who most directly and most consistently refuses to accommodate the systems that Springfield has built to maintain its preferred version of reality. He disrupts the school, which is one of the primary institutional sites of Springfield's reality maintenance. He challenges authority figures, who are the agents of the social contract that keeps inconvenient truths suppressed. He creates chaos in an environment that depends on controlled narrative for its operation. He is, in the contamination theory's framework, the child most resistant to the cognitive impairment that the contamination is supposed to produce, not because he is immune to it, but because his particular neural profile responds to the impairment by becoming more rather than less resistant to institutional control. The contamination, in Bart's case, may have produced not the passive compliance it produces in Homer, but its opposite, a hyperactive defiance of the systems that the compliance serves. If the radiation produces different outcomes in different individuals, as the comparison between Homer and Maggie suggests it does, then Bart may represent a third variant. Not diminished like Homer, not supercharged like Maggie, but destabilized in a specific direction. Toward disruption, toward the inability to sit still inside structures that were designed to keep people sitting still, toward a relentless impulse to pull at the threads of the world around him without quite having the capacity to understand what the threads are connected to. Bart pulls the threads. He has been pulling them for 36 years. He just does not know what he is pulling on. He is too young and too impaired by his own version of the contamination's effects to see what the threads connect to. But the pulling is real, and the threads are real, and somewhere underneath the comedy of a 10-year-old boy who cannot stop causing trouble, something is being slowly loosened. The show's final image is worth dwelling on. Not the literal final episode because the show has not ended, but the emotional final image toward which every episode points. The couch. The family on the couch. The television on. The image that the opening credits have been building toward since the first season. The specific domestic scene that the show has been returning to and departing from for 36 years. The couch is not just a recurring gag. It is the destination. The place the show is always trying to get back to. Every adventure ends here. Every disaster resolves here. Every reset deposits the family here. The contamination theory. The couch is the place where the cognitively impaired population of a contamination zone retreats to watch the television that fills their evenings, too damaged to question why the evenings feel heavy in a way they cannot name. The coma theory. The couch is the last place Homer was before the vending machine fell. The couch, the television, the family gathered around it, this is the image that his dreaming mind built the entire simulation to return to. Every episode is a journey away from and back to this specific moment. The couch is not a furniture item. It is the meaning of the dream. The principle and the pauper theory. The couch is the site of the community's collective agreement to accept the version of reality the television provides and not look up from it. The family on the couch, watching, is Springfield in miniature, a community gathered around its shared fiction, sustaining the fiction through the act of watching it together, voting every evening for the comfortable version of events by choosing to be here rather than anywhere else. All three readings, all three pointing at the same piece of furniture in the same yellow house, on the same street in the same impossible town. Springfield, where the loop runs, where the family stays, where the cooling towers hum, and the fish have 3 eyes, and the oldest man in America glows in the dark once a week, and the baby watches everything from her high chair with the patience of someone who has been building toward something for 36 years and is not in any hurry because she has all the time she needs. She is 1 year old. She will always be 1 year old, and she is watching you. One more thread what the show knows about itself. The Simpsons is 36 seasons old, and it knows it. This self-awareness has been part of the show's DNA since at least the 4th season, when it began making jokes that required awareness of itself as a long-running cultural institution rather than simply a new animated series trying to find its audience. By the time the show began officially acknowledging its own record's longest-running animated series, longest-running primetime scripted series, longest-running American sitcom, the self-awareness had become a subject in itself. The show knows what it is. It has known for a long time. What the show has not done, in 36 years of self-awareness, is confront the question of what its extraordinary longevity means for the theories its audience has spent those same 36 years constructing. The coma theory asks whether Homer woke up. The show says yes, but the show saying yes is itself evidence the coma theorists point to. Of course the show says yes. The show cannot say anything else. Confirming the coma would end the show. Confirming the coma would require acknowledging that everything after 1993 has been a dream, that the characters are not real in the way the show has always presented them as real, that the audience has been watching a dying man's imagination rather than a family's adventures. The show cannot confirm this and continue, so it denies it. And the denial, the coma theorists say, is exactly what you would expect from a narrative that needs to keep running. The contamination theory faces the same limitation. If the show confirmed that Springfield's residents are contaminated truly confirmed it, made it the explicit stated reality of the show rather than the implied reality, its evidence suggests the comedy becomes impossible to sustain. You cannot run jokes about Homer eating donuts at a nuclear facility once you have explicitly framed the facility as the source of the town's mutation. The comedy depends on the contamination remaining in the register of implication rather than confirmation. So, the show implies and never confirms, and the implication accumulates for 36 years until it becomes something that feels very much like confirmation to anyone paying close attention. This is the show's deepest sophistication. It has built its most serious argument into its most durable comedy, using the comedy as the vehicle that makes the argument survivable. The jokes are what allow the contamination theory to accumulate for 36 years without the show having to answer for it. The comedy is the cover under which the show has been saying, very quietly and very consistently, everything it cannot say directly. Springfield has been telling you the truth the whole time, dressed as a joke, and the joke kept running, kept being funny, kept drawing the audience back every week, while the truth inside it accumulated in the background until it was too large to miss for anyone who stopped looking at the joke and started looking at what the joke was built around. Bart is 10, Maggie is watching, Burns is glowing once a week in the woods. Homer is in his chair in Sector 7G, asleep at his workstation, while the reactor hums behind the glass and the water flows downstream, and the fish keep finding new ways to be different from the fish anywhere else in the world. Springfield is still there. It will always be there. It cannot be found on any map, which means it cannot be shut down, which means it will keep running indefinitely, which means the family will keep being intact, the loop will keep looping, and the cooling towers will keep releasing whatever they release into whatever air surrounds, whatever town this is, wherever it is, for as long as the agreement holds. And the agreement holds as long as we keep watching. As long as we keep choosing to be inside Springfield rather than outside it. As long as the couch gag plays and the family gathers and the show runs and the loop tightens its hold, one episode at a time, on the 36 years of us that have been sustaining it. We are the agreement. We have always been the agreement, and we will keep watching. The show will run next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. Homer will stumble through the door. Marge will be patient. Bart will be 10. Lisa will raise her hand and be ignored. And Maggie will sit in her high chair with those enormous dark eyes and watch everything, the way she has always watched everything, saying nothing, giving nothing away, waiting for the moment she has been preparing for since the day she was born. In a hospital in a town that does not appear on any map, to a father who may have been dreaming the whole time. The loop will run. It always runs.